Okay. All right. Thank you all for helping us to make sure that we follow the rules here. It's, as I said earlier, it's difficult times. Let me begin by just making sure that Tara here has all of the folks that want to testify. We have a lot of folks that are going to testify today, and so we may have to, when we get to that portion, determine how long we will allow to do just that. And so I want to thank all the committee members that are here in person and also those that are here remotely. And Tara, you have those before you, it seems. Okay, very good. We're going to take up today, folks, two very important measures that I'm going to ask this committee to really study the issues. We, at our first meeting, had DCH, Healthcare Facility Regulations, speak to more broadly their role in regulating licensed long-term care facilities and hospitals in this state. I think that was good information to educate our committee about these matters. As I mentioned then, I suspected we would have several important pieces of legislation this year that would make that information helpful to each member. And so I think that was a good start. We're going to hear today some testimony from the department as well. But let me begin by telling you that we are going to start with House Bill 290. There is a substitute to House Bill 290 that Chairman Setzler will explain in a moment. But I do want to say this first. This issue that Chairman Setzler will speak to today is a powerful one for all of us. You know, this past 11 months with COVID have brought so much calamity to society, and so many of us, I think every member has dealt with their own families, their friends, issues that really are relevant to this bill we will discuss today. I cannot tell you how many members have come up to me and spoken about an interest in this bill. I will tell you that personally, I lost my father during COVID, not due to COVID. I lost my father due to a drunk driver at 8 a.m. But as he was in the hospital as a paraplegic, dying, his family couldn't see him. I was able to see him, but my siblings couldn't. And I will tell you, it had a powerful impact on my family. This issue affects Georgians far and wide. This issue affects our people. Everybody that will testify today on both sides of this issue want what is best to protect people. But this issue has been felt by all of us. And so I appreciate the sponsor attempting to help us to solve what is a very real issue. Chairman Setzler, if you are prepared, we will hear your substitute on House Bill 290.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. It is an honor to be here today to present to you an issue that is addresses and has addressed tens of thousands of families across our state just in this last year alone, not to mention times before this year that this issue might have been felt in the past. HB 290 is a bill that developed over the course of the last several months. It was initially brought to our attention last spring with many of the lockdowns that happened as part of the public health emergency declared by our governor. And as things progressed, as practices advanced and the way to treat the novel coronavirus became more and more familiarized really across the healthcare profession, the issue of access to family members, caregivers who are a critical part of people's healthcare delivery, moved some, but in my view, did not move adequately and does not put us in a place that we can sit back and say the system took care of itself. HB 290 is a bill that recognizes that health care is more than pills. Health care is more than monitors, x-rays, the production of meals, and candidly, the prevention of death of patients. Healthcare inextricably includes wellness, mental health, activity, purpose, engagement of people with familiarity, connection, and individualized advocacy for people being cared for that no healthcare system, even the best healthcare systems, can ever hope to provide, in ways that family members who care for and spend time around patients day in, day out, year in, year out, decade in, decade out, could ever possibly provide. The purpose, Mr. Chairman, of House Bill 290 is not to assign any kind of blame. It's not to respond to a public outcry, an uprising of animated constituents, although there are tens of thousands of people who have spoken to their legislators and hundreds of thousands of people for whom this is an acute, very, very important issue. It's not in any way dismissive of coronavirus and the treatment challenges that the novel coronavirus in our healthcare system has raised. And nor is it intended to overreach or be rash or inattentive to detail. It's intended to be spot on and focused and measured in its approach. Mr. Chairman, HB 290 is intended to be a thoughtful response to thoughtful advocacy, thoughtful engagement by people who have lived a life, in many cases, some of whom are healthcare providers themselves. Others are folks that manage large, complex organizations and look at what's happening and say, you know what, we can do better than this. House Bill 290 is intended to have a light touch. It's not intended to be overly burdensome. It's intended to address only those things that need to be addressed in statute. And it's intended to do so with a very careful legal balance. We balance access to essential caregivers and the essential care by families and the legal protections that healthcare providers need to be able to deliver that in the complexities of potential future emergencies. It's intended to maximize the flexibility for providers, maximize the flexibility so in their setting, in their context, they make the substantial decisions on how this process, this essential caregiver process is played out, whether it's in a long-term care setting or whether it's in a hospital setting. But it is intended to do one thing, Mr. Chairman. That's something I want to be very clear about. It is intended to set a minimum standard of 2 people and access for 2 hours per day as a minimum standard that essential caregivers, family members and loved ones of patients can have access physically to those patients in ways that enhance the healthcare system, not undermine it, that enhances wellness, that enhances public health outcomes, and in no way undermines it. Mr. Chairman, we've taken input from healthcare providers, we've taken input from attorney groups, we've taken input from committee members. I appreciate the feedback, the very specific feedback, the very detailed feedback I've gotten from many members of this committee. And it also follows, and it is mindful of, although it doesn't copy, but it is mindful of an essential caregiver model that's been put in place in other states that doesn't do it like HB 290 does, but in the states of Indiana, Minnesota, Texas, Missouri, and Oklahoma have an essential caregiver framework that's been delivered by the healthcare system, by healthcare providers, with many of the same framework, with much the same framework, and many of the guardrails that HB 290 addresses. But HB 290 does, in fact, do one essential thing. It does require a minimum statutory standard of 2 people having access 2 hours a day to be part of that healthcare delivery environment. Mr. Chairman, I do want to be respectful of our committee's time. As we do this, and before I walk through the bill, if it pleases the chair, I would like to share one story. I know there's some folks that will share some stories, but the story I'm going to share today, if it's acceptable to the chairman, is I'm trying to share my screen. Can you guys see there we are. Let's see if this is, oops. Okay. Mr. Chairman, Miss Karina Yakimovich of Ackworth, Georgia, lives just outside of my district. She didn't actually approach me to do this bill. I've met her in the process of putting this together. But her mother, her 95-year-old mother, is actually in a long-term facility in the district of Representative Martin Newton, my co-sponsor of this bill. You can see her. She, Miss Ingeborg DeCampley, has spent most of her life in the Augusta, Evans area, and before the coronavirus pandemic hit, before the emergency happened, she was visited daily by family and friends, church members. She spent much of her life in the Augusta area. And you see the picture of her taken in February of 2020 before the pandemic hit. After the onset of the pandemic, Ms. DeCampley asked her daughter, "Why does no one come visit me anymore? What happened?" The provisions of safety in her long-term care environment was that once every 2 weeks, a family member could come in through a FaceTime call and interact with mom. Now, that was the sole discretion of that particular provider. We're not going to single out providers, but it's not uncharacteristic, this provider, of what may be happening across the state in a long-term care setting, and it's analogous to things we would see in hospital settings. When we look at the outcome of Ms. Ingmar, you can see the picture in February 2020, and without having contracted coronavirus, and without having contracted any acute condition in the ensuing year, you see a picture her daughter took of her in February 2021 after 12 months of absolute isolation from family members and essential caregivers. We're in no way suggesting that the life-saving provision of health care was undermined. They didn't feed her bad food. She didn't get an infection that dramatically took her health care on a nosedive. But the idea that health care is, in an elder care setting like this, is death prevention, nutrition, just the mechanics of helping people perform their basic bodily functions, is laid very clearly bare by this picture that her daughter shared with me. There's some other folks that we'll have a chance to show some pictures of and tell the story of. But Mr. Chairman, this one story from Ms. Yakimovich is, I think, worthy of being heard by the committee, because I think it distills the spirit and the essence of our bill. And before I walk through the bill, I'll simply read part of her statement. February 7th, 2021, the last time I touched my 95-year-old mother was 350 days ago. My mother, Ingeborg DeCampley, lives in a long-term care facility in Evans, Georgia. She suffers from dementia and congestive heart failure. She was a 13-year-old girl in 1938 when the German Wehrmacht rolled into her village. She grew up in Sudeten, Czechoslovakia. She was a Sudeten Czech. Her village was captured by the Germans. After the war, she married an American serviceman and spent her life as an American citizen, as a great lover of this country. My mother's been isolated and separated from her family since February of 2020. Again, in the words of Ms. Yakimovich, not my words, this long and cruel period of separation has caused mental issues, physical concerns, as well as emotional challenges for my mother. Due to weight loss and depression issues during the pandemic, my mother was placed on medication for depression. Her mobility has decreased. Her cognitive abilities have declined. Her socialization skills have suffered. And her overall health and well-being has been essentially stripped from her. Without any accusation of malpractice, my mother celebrated her 95th birthday alone, and without fanfare during quarantine, not to mention all the holidays, including Christmas, she spent in isolation. Prior to COVID-19, my mother had family, friends, and church members that visited her every single day, 7 days a week. When I speak to her now via FaceTime call, which is permitted once every 2 weeks, she asks me repeatedly, "Where are all the people? And why doesn't anyone come to see me anymore?" Ms. Yakimovich goes on to say, my mother has basic human rights. My mother has basic human needs. My mother did not lose her family because of COVID-19. My mother needs human touch. She needs her family by her side in this last season of her life. Ms. Yakimovich is emphatic when she says, I am part of my mother's health care team. I'm a vital player in her mental health and in her physical wellness. And she goes on to conclude, I am begging each one of you in the legislature, please give your strong support for House Bill 290 so that I can see, touch, love on, and help my mother heal from the horrible mental and psychological effects of this pandemic. Horrible effects indeed. I appreciate Ms. Yakimovich's willing to share that with her testimony is in your folders. And Mr. Chairman, with that is the picture of not just one family, but tens of thousands of families across the state, which was really the purpose and the reason for being of House Bill 290. Mr. Chairman, again, I don't know how you want me to present. If it pleases the chair, I'd love to walk through the bill. We do have a substitute that's been offered that's, again, adopted a number of recommended changes from the bill that was originally filed, and I just wanted to ask direction from the chair.
Chairman Setzler, yes, if you would please walk through the bill and particularly explain changes in the substitute from the original bill.
Okay, I'm trying to unshare my screen here, so this is, okay. Mr. Chairman, the version we're working on today is LC version 338611S. That's the committee substitute that I'm offering today to the committee. It creates a new section entitled, new code section entitled 31, which is seen on page 2. And again, this is under the short title of Right to Visit Act. On lines 18 through 22, we create a definition of essential caregiver. And I appreciate very much the assistance, the essential caregiver toolkit I can make available to members. This was provided to me by a member of this committee. This is the framework. It's a multi-page framework with forms and model policies that was developed by the long-term care providers nationally. This is the framework that was put in place in the 5 states I mentioned, Indiana, Minnesota, Missouri, Oklahoma, and Texas. This was implemented among the long-term care community, but many of the procedures would apply directly both to long-term care and hospitals. And again, we're not looking to put all this detail in the statute, but simply with the two-person, two-hour prescription, we adopted some of the definitions of an essential caregiver. And Mr. Chairman, the essential caregiver is the family member or the friend, the person that has an habitual long-term relationship that predates the hospitalization or being in the long-term care facility. The person must be more than 18 years of age and who regularly engaged in companionship or assistance to the individual before they got into the hospital or the long-term care environment. Again, they advocate for the loved one, and they also support in the management of their health care, and overall well-being and decision-making. As many folks, as they get up in years, might not be clear when they last had their doctor's visit. They might be a little bit fuzzy on some of their prescriptions or what their medical history was. Likewise for young people. Even people that are 18, 19, and 20 that can speak for themselves legally might be a little bit fuzzy about their shot records and some of those things that the parents and other family members can provide in a critical care context in a hospital or a long-term care context in a long-term care facility. Next definition, Mr. Chairman, again, this bill applies to hospitals and what we call long-term care facilities. That includes skilled nursing homes, intermediate care, personal care homes, assisted living communities, smaller community living arrangements, as well as inpatient hospice. That is the definition of long-term care facilities as it applies to HB 290. And what HB 290 does, Mr. Chairman, beginning on line 28, that on or after July 1st of this year, giving the healthcare providers, the long-term care providers time to implement these rules. I didn't want to make this applicable upon the governor's signature. But as of January 1st of this year, requires that they implement the core provisions of HB 290. What we're in essence saying is that these essential caregivers would have an opportunity, again, required by law, to have in-person visits for any person that's been in a care environment for longer than 24 hours. So if you can imagine somebody that's in a setting that they've had a trauma, they're whisked away in an ambulance, they go to the hospital. This does not contemplate, while that's happening, while they're in the operating room, that their family members get to come in. This is not what this is addressing. This is for people that are spending the night in the hospital for one night or multiple nights, or spending days, weeks, months, potentially years in long-term care facilities. So that 24-hour requirement is important because it doesn't give people the right to come in and say, I can push my way into the hospital and see my family member. It does apply during public health emergencies, although it's very important to hear this. This is not a change to the governor's emergency powers in Title 38. So if a governor, pursuant to his emergency powers under public health emergencies, chose to restrict access and visitation by essential caregivers in an emergency declaration, the governor would still have the power to do that. What this bill addresses is if the governor does not specifically prohibit visitation during public health emergencies, or put a framework on it like we have now that's tiered based on the COVID testing in a specific county, if none of those provisions are put in place by the governor, pursuant to his emergency powers, the default condition would be that 2 people could visit for up to 2 hours for 2 hours at least per day, pursuant to the regulations and the processes that the healthcare provider or the long-term care facility puts in place themselves. So I want to make sure we're clear about that. This does not take away the governor's power to limit visitation in long-term care or hospital facilities, but if the governor does not act through his public health powers, the baseline default condition is that there would be the ability for these essential caregivers to visit their loved ones. On line 33, Mr. Chairman, it's very important to see, this is the other piece of this, that hospitals and long-term care facilities should not be prevented from imposing reasonable safety precautions relating to the physical presence of these essential caregivers. What this means is this reasonableness standard gives all of the power to the hospitals and all of the power to the long-term care providers to decide time, manner, place, conditions in which this visitation can happen. We think it's very important to give that power to the hospitals and the long-term care providers. The settings and the context in which this all plays out needs the flexibility that hospitals and long-term care providers uniquely know about their settings. For example, in an assisted living facility, there may be a day room that all the people come to spend time with their family members. Keeping family members out of the visitation rooms and back in the facility, that's perhaps a better setting for them. In a hospital setting, however, if there's somebody in an ICU ward that's under careful watch, the requirements might be much more rigorous in terms of getting back there. In all these settings during the coronavirus pandemic, I would anticipate the hospital or long-term care facility requiring a negative coronavirus test, requiring masks, and in some cases, if they're going up in a room in an ICU ward, they might require a full PPE arrangement to be able to visit with your family member. All of those things are given to the long-term care facility or the hospital to decide themselves by statute, because they and they alone understand the appropriate context in which this happens. What this bill does do, however, it does require they can't say, you can't come. They get to set the rules, they get to set the conditions for 2 people to be able to visit at least 2 hours a day. That's what the bill does, Mr. Chairman. And I want to lean in and say that there's valid concerns from people who want to understand how this affects them. If you have a hospital in your district, or you have a long-term care facility in your district, they will determine the time, manner, place, conditions in which this plays out, in which these visitations happen by the essential caregivers, not us. Okay? And as I said, Mr. Chairman, this does, once that framework's in place, it does, in fact, put in place this minimum, what I believe to be a soft touch, which says 2 people designated for 2 hours a day. Mr. Chairman, if we turn over to page 3, lines 40 through 51 of the bill, some of the language here is incorporating feedback I've gotten from members of this committee. In fact, forgive me, before you move on, lines 37 through 38 on page 2. This came from the Essential Caregiver Toolkit, again, consistent with what was implemented in these other 5 states, that says the patient or resident does have the discretion to change their essential caregivers, but they do it in accordance with reasonable guidelines established by the hospital or long-term care facility. They don't have the right to say, today my caregiver is person A and person B, and then tomorrow person C and person D. Reasonable provisions. If the requirements they produce and pay for their own PCR test that proves they're negative for coronavirus, they've watched perhaps a 15-minute video of the rules to understand the program. Those requirements are put in place by the long-term care providers in the hospitals, but once those are met, they have to put a process in place to allow people to change their essential caregivers based upon a standard of reasonableness. And I think that reasonableness standard, which applies often in the courts, is reasonable, Mr. Chairman. I mean, as you think about this, how else are we going to, we don't contemplate a highly litigious environment. I believe healthcare providers will be given broad discretion to do this. I think once they embrace this, they understand it. They recognize it's very little we're doing. We're saying 2 people for 2 hours a day minimum. I think it'll be broadly embraced and well put together and well thought through and fairly thought through by our providers to establish what those conditions are. Mr. Chairman, another change on lines 40 through 41, which is very important, I think, to the providers and the hospitals, is that we specify in statute that the hospital or long-term care facility may suspend or even terminate the status of an essential caregiver if they fail to comply with the rules and the safety provisions. I think it's very important. That puts teeth in their authority to enforce their own rules, and I think that this was a very helpful addition that a member of our committee brought, again, based on this multi-state framework, that hospitals and long-term care providers could say, you broke the rules, you're suspended, you broke the rules twice, you're out, not coming back. That power is given explicitly to the providers in the statute. Lines 42 through 43 simply says that nothing in this code section could be construed that the essential caregiver, the family member, would ever be seen as an employee or the agent of the hospital. It just says they're not. They're not. The hospital has no responsibility, power over, or direction over them. They are their own individual persons, so there's no legal link between them. Just want to be very clear that this idea of essential caregiver doesn't conflate 2 distinct ideas that need to remain distinct. They're individual people. They don't work for the hospital system or for the long-term care provider. And then lastly, on lines 44 through 51, the liability provisions. One very important part of this bill, we talk about the advantages and the disadvantages. We are, as a legislature, prescribing these providers provide access. But what we're doing to counterbalance that is we're providing enhanced legal protection for the long-term care facility or the hospital, essentially consistent with our current coronavirus framework. And we put that in place back in June. It was extended by the House. It's going to the Senate yesterday. But that framework to protect the hospitals with a little more protection than a potential gotcha environment, we think is important to kind of counterbalance this. The original bill was filed. It gave blanket indemnity. That's not really where I wanted to be. This is about where I think we need to be. It's an enhanced protection. It's not an absolute indemnification. It's not absolute relieving them of responsibility. But again, it creates that balancing effect because we are imposing the requirement to allow visitation, Mr. Chairman. That's the bill. It's a short bill. I think we've tried to take feedback, and I know this is a process, and I'd love to hear questions from members of the committee if it pleases the chair.
Thank you, Chairman Sensler. We first have a question from our vice chair, which is remote. Do you want me to read that, or can he speak? Okay. Representative Kirby, you have a question, I understand. Is it not working? Hold on one second, Representative Kirby. We're working on it. Is that what we needed? Okay, try now.
All right.
There you go. Okay. Proceed.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. No. Wow, there's quite a delay coming back through my speakers. All right, my question is simple. You talked about if we go into a long-term care facility or a hospital and they require some type of PPE, are they going to supply the PPE, or does the family member have to supply their own PPE? And if the family member is supplying it, is there a process to make sure it's approved and appropriate and everything's correct? And I hope Rebecca Mitchell doesn't mind. I'll go ahead and jump on here that she was also talking about the fit testing on the N95s as well. Who would these responsibilities fall on?
Yep. That's completely at the discretion of the long-term care facility or the hospital. There is no requirement that it be provided to them, and it's completely up to them to establish that in their setting. I went into a ambulatory surgery center setting back in December. I had arthroscopic surgery on my knee, and one of the requirements placed upon me by my healthcare provider as a patient to come in was to get a PCR coronavirus test within 5 days of care, to demonstrate that I was negative, to keep track of my temperature over a 7-day period leading up to my care, have my temperature taken before I went in, read an informational packet of responsibilities. Those are things that providers are requiring of patients. And I certainly wouldn't expect those standards to be lowered in this setting. I paid and/or my insurance paid for my PCR test. There's certainly no requirement for any provider to provide masks or PPE. I would anticipate it's the responsibility of the individual to do that, and I think that's completely appropriate. So there's no requirement in this bill that the providers or the hospital furnish that. I think their only standard would be to establish a fair and reasonable approach consistent with the setting and the circumstances, and I have high confidence they can do that. And in fact, Representative Kirby, what I would anticipate would likely be the case, my son, my 22-year-old, is working his way through college, working in a assisted living facility 40 hours a week, and I look at what he does to have access to work with seniors, many of whom are in memory care and in a fragile environment, and the things he goes through, to me, don't seem inconsistent with what you would require an essential caregiver to do. There's no reason that the essential caregiver wouldn't have to meet the same standards that in terms of safety and temperature and testing that a hospital employee provides. And the reason I say that is because this isn't some new system that needs to be created. If the standards for essential caregivers were held to be the same as an employee, it would just be more people added to the same system. It's what you're already doing. You're keeping track of these things for people. It's just taking employees, patients, and you're just adding more people to the same system to make sure they're safe and able to be in that environment.
All right, thank you.
One more question remotely from Representative Mitchell. Representative Mitchell?
Oh, Representative Kirby actually combined our two questions sufficiently. Thank you there.
All right. We have lots of questions. Let's go to number 5. Representative Bonner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Chairman Setzler, for bringing the bill. Just a kind of, I guess, a point of clarification. Why would it not say family members and or essential caregiver, in as much as just using my own example with kids off at college? If I go into the hospital and stay overnight, I've got a kid who's been away for months that I would want to come see me, but does the definition of essential caregiver include family members, or is it covering family members and others?
It's some of both. It's a more specific definition than just family members. Now, I'm open to the pleasure of the committee as they would address this. The original bill was filed that talked about family and friends. Okay, what we've done in this is we've defined we've created a more defined term of essential caregiver, which is a family member or a friend that meets these conditions, that's 18 years of age or older, So what this substitute does is it takes away the ability for a 9-year-old to go visit grandma in a facility. If the hospital or nursing home says 9-year-olds are not welcome, we're still going to give them that power. They can turn away 17-year-old family members under this bill. But if they're 18 years old or older, this idea of them being an important part of healthcare delivery, being an important part of coming around people and looking after them, we feel like that's a circumstance where, you know, kids who are symptomatic might not even know that they're symptomatic and are sick and are bringing things in. Sort of the chaos that kids could bring to this was eliminated in the substitute. I think there's a real advantage personally to small kids and grandkids coming in and seeing grandma. I think it's very meaningful. But in this substitute, we have shrunk that down. We've narrowed that down to only people 18 years of age or older, because again, this importance of them providing the kind of care, advice, support that is more consistent with the sensitivities and the concerns raised by many of the stakeholders here. So I mean, I think it's others might disagree and say it ought to be any age and any family member. And I'm personally friendly to that in some ways, but having heard from the providers that this issue is a concern, we came with this more narrow definition.
Yeah, I think a part of my own challenge is that if we're going to create a standard, it seems to me that anyone that meets that standard ought to be able to visit. So if the standard is simply an age, I mean, that's one thing, but if the standard is you have to go through these steps in order to visit, i.e. a test, I mean, you know, my 12-year-old had to test before she went somewhere. So,
Sure.
You know, so if it's an issue of procedures, it seems to me that it should be or could possibly be open to anyone who could achieve those benchmarks.
Sure.
Right. But again,
and that, as you know, that'll be the pleasure of the committee. I mean, I literally thought about 16. I thought about 12. 10 or older. I thought about is there a dividing line there? Should it be any age? I'm not going to try to prejudge that one, Mr. Chairman. This is a narrowing of this for purposes of accommodating the healthcare interests of some folks who are nervous. But no, I appreciate the question.
Chairman Jaspers.
Thank you, Chairman Petrie. Chairman Setzler, I appreciate you. Maybe for a different reason, that you seeked me out this morning to take time to explain your bill in thoroughness. And I think it's a lesson I'm sure you did it to many others too, and I think it's a lesson that many members need to take in working on a bill that's this passionate, and I appreciate that very much. I want you to look on line 23 and 24. Where we talk about essential caregivers, et cetera, and it says that it's going to advocate for someone's needs and support them in managing their health care. And I kind of took that in a little bit of a different way because I've dealt with this recently. We're not setting up a system or something here that creates a binding advocacy where an individual may not have advance directive, may not have powers of attorney, that this individual who is an essential caregiver can advocate or change or direct the care that someone's in. And this is something I've sat here and thought about. We can talk about it later, but sure. That's a concern that I see in here.
Yeah, I would tell you there's nothing in putting this in Title 31 that's going to affect the advance directives, the durable power of attorney, and those code sections. I think this is trying to flesh out what it means to be an essential caregiver, family member, friend, that there is an important component of this. It's not just I want to visit because we like to hang out, but there is an importance to helping manage health care, helping guide decisions and providing advocacy. I mean, you can imagine the lady we showed on the screen, 95 years old, probably doesn't know her own health care records by heart, but her daughter does. There's a real health care outcome benefit to this bill. This doesn't undermine outcomes. It helps outcomes because of these things in those two lines.
Well, I'm not debating that there's a real health care outcome, Chairman. Mine is just that it seems to me that we're kind of setting up for an individual who may empower themselves to think they can be this advocate in decision-making.
Yeah. Well, I will certainly tell you, in establishing who these people are, it's going to be ultimately the decision of the person that has the medical power of attorney, or the person in care themselves, to decide this person, not that person, or if they've got dueling family members, this person is, that person's not. The person making the medical decisions will have to make those decisions.
Representative Wynn.
You know, this is challenging because I know this is an issue that impacts a lot of us, not just across the state, but across the country. Mm-hmm. And I fully recognize the intent of the bill, and it is something that I would want to support from a really heartfelt, emotional place. And the stories that I've read, the story that you told, Chairman, mirrors the story of my own family member. When the start of COVID happened, she was in long-term care facility. She suffered from dementia, a really fast, rapid-paced dementia, and her leg was amputated as we were going through this crisis. And she did pass away, and we could see that she suffered from depression, and we could see how much worse the isolation made things for her. And we were unable to give her a proper burial service. And so from a really heartfelt place, from recognizing exactly why this bill is here, I understand that. Where I am most concerned is the reasonable safety requirements and how we ensure that we are keeping other patients safe, especially in long-term care facilities, where we know that over the past year we've seen massive breakouts. And so my question is there any consideration to establishing minimum requirements for safety? Because we know this virus is so incredibly dangerous. As we were contemplating the holidays, many of us wanted to make sure we could spend time with our families. And the recommendation by CDC was essentially, if you wanted to do that, there was still an inherent risk, but the recommendation was to quarantine 10 to 14 days in advance before seeing family members and then taking a test, because we know the tests can't encapsulate the current moment in time. And even as you mentioned, the governor's emergency order, it does consider COVID outbreaks. And so my question is, would it be prudent to consider minimum safety requirements because of the dangerous nature of the virus?
Well, I mean, I appreciate the question. I'm not hostile to the question itself. I mean, I think I approach this, I mean, I asked myself the same question, Representative, was what should we prescribe and what should we not prescribe? And there's such a diversity of settings. There's such a diversity of conditions that this could apply to. And this is not just a bill for 2021. This is a bill for the years, for the decades, right? And where I landed was there's no way for us to anticipate any number of conditions. The idea of quarantining 12 to 14 days, that's a novel coronavirus COVID-19 rubric, but that's wholly inadequate if the incubation period or the period of being contagious is 30 days for something that could come up. I mean, we can't, I think it's impossible for us as legislators to solve that particular issue. I think the best thing is we talk about reasonable safety requirements. I mean, the reasonableness standard is what hospitals apply themselves. And again, the idea of people having access to their facilities is not unique just to these caregivers. You think about Ms. Yakimovich, who's in her early 60s, empty nester. There's no kids in her home. There could be a nurse who lives here that's got 2 high school kids and a middle schooler. 3 kids. There's people coming to her house. There's a lot of vectors from a coronavirus perspective, of coronavirus risk in this employee nurse's house that would exceed that of this caregiver. right? So if you step back and say, well, gosh, it's more dangerous to have this nurse come into our hospital than it is to have this caregiver come into our hospital when you think about it. So I'm not hostile to your question. As I've thought about this, I think that is something that is uniquely the hospitals to decide for themselves. Likewise, the provisions that's required of the caregivers is uniquely the hospitals themselves. I just don't think there's any way we could ever, in 2021, solve that issue for conditions we don't even know may come up. And if we had done this in 2016, we could have never anticipated a coronavirus and know that 12 to 14 days is the right number of days, if you follow the logic.
And Mr. Chair, if I may, what about contact tracing? What would that look like in these specific facilities and hospitals?
Yeah, I don't think the contact tracing regime changes at all. I think, as I alluded to before, you've got hospital employees, you have agents that come in to collect the trash or to handle bio waste that are not employees. You've got patients. You've got a whole community. It's a whole beehive of people in a big hospital system, right? Some of whom are employees, some of whom come in as contractors, some of whom are patients. So those processes exist today, even if you bolt on this category of essential caregiver. It's just, Grady Hospital, for example, might go from having a couple thousand people there to a couple thousand plus, 200 more people in a given day. So I don't think it changes it at all. I think it's just more people that are grafted into those exact same systems that we have today.
And then, Mr. Chair, just one final thing. I do have some concerns about the immunity provision, and I appreciate that you did change the language on it to allow for some accountability and not gross blanket immunity. But my concern is, in Georgia, we've seen a history of facilities just being very negligent towards the people that they're supposed to care for. And so I do have concerns about immunity provisions in the bill. I don't necessarily have a question related to it, but I did want to express my concern for that.
And to your question, I mean, this is, as with a lot of these issues, Representative, we're trying to balance these things sort of on the head of a pin. I would direct you, perhaps it would allay some of your fears, lines 33 through 34, imposing reasonable safety requirements, and then it goes on to say, relating to the physical presence of any such essential caregivers. So this tweak to the liability structure is limited to circumstances as it relates to the physical presence of any such caregiver in the hospital or long-term care facility. So it's only changed as it relates to their physical presence. It's not, if the hospital is leaving, rags and towels in the corner of a room and not doing the things they ought to do, this has no impact on that. It's only as it relates to these caregivers, which we as a legislature are requiring they take in. It is that very limited circumstance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Gamble.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Setzler, I too want to echo what Chairman Jasper said. I appreciate you coming to me individually this morning in the ante room to discuss this bill. I think we've all had stories that we can relate to from 2020 and even now into 2021 with constituents. For me personally, Ms. Thelma Kimmons was one of the first that I was confronted with. Unfortunately, she passed away earlier this last year. And then Ms. Polly Aycock and her family reached out as well, and as many others. So they're very much on my mind today as we talk about this bill. I do have a question related to, as we discuss COVID and particularly the vaccine that is out, would these long-term care facilities still have the discretion as to whether or not they require their staff to take or not take the COVID-19 vaccine? Yes, sir.
This bill has no impact on any of these facilities' requirements relating to their staff.
Okay.
Period.
Thank you.
Representative Eric Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Setzler. I wish I could have gotten on that list to talk to you in the ante room earlier, but so two things. One, a concern, one a clarification question. But you mentioned the word earlier, balance. I think one of the things.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
You mentioned the word balance.
Balance, yes, sir.
And one of the things that just sticks out to me as a concern is that in this legislation, we would be taking away any tool for a facility in the instance of it being an outbreak or a hotspot to be able to have any reasonable restrictions to say maybe we take a 5-day pause or a 3-day pause. I understand the bill, and I think you're coming from the right place. Sure. But I do worry that we're going too far and taking away the ability for them to provide care. And I understand the immunity provision, but being in the business, I understand it's not legal action that we think about in hospitals and in healthcare. We're thinking about the safety of the people we're providing care for. And I would just like to see more of the balance. And you can tell me if that was a consideration or if you're open to giving them some type of mechanism to provide a safe space in the event of an outbreak or they become a hotspot.
Yeah, yes, sir. And I would tell you there's, balance is what this is about. I think the important thing to understand is, I think there's almost a false premise that's brought into this. That, and I don't want to overstate my case, I don't want to be callous about how I say it, but I do think there's a false premise that we all have to be conscious of, is that visitors are nice, visitors are fun to have, visitors make people happier, it's kind of like your weekend, it's sort of the day off. That's not, I challenge that premise. And I don't know the extent to which you're saying it, but I mean, I sense a little of that question in your own thinking. It's fair question. I believe, and the reason that we limited this to 18 years old or older and a pre-existing relationship with the patient is that these family members coming in are our essential caregivers, that providing care in addition to drugs, medicine, dialysis, testing equipment, death prevention, disease prevention. I think the premise in all of this is that these people coming in are part of care.
And I understand that.
Yeah.
That part I understand.
Yeah.
What I'm addressing, if you look at line 29, just the part where it says shall not institute any policy.
Yep.
So in the case of an emergency, I think we're taking away their ability to respond in the instance of a crisis. That's my only concern.
That's right. As I alluded to earlier, I want to divide I'd like to draw the contour in the policy, what we're saying and what we're not saying. I'm not running from the fact that we're saying you shall provide 2 people access for 2 hours a day and have a process that you define however you want it. If the conditions get way more acute or more dangerous, there's nothing that wouldn't say, Representative Allen, you want to come see your wife in the hospital? 2 months ago, you could have just come in with a mask and a COVID test and a temperature. Because of these circumstances, it's a full PPE, face mask, test, and we're going to monitor you while you're there. I would anticipate that. And I think that's why this idea of what procedures we need to put in place can't be defined by us. It's got to be defined by the facility. I think if there's something that gave rise to an outbreak that's so intense, it's outside of the control of anybody to be able to handle, and even those circumstances couldn't work. That's where we talk about the governor's public health emergency powers. We're not taking away the governor's public health emergency powers. So even today, some counties would be subject to this, but other counties, based on their testing rates, still wouldn't be subject to the 4 corners of this bill if it were to pass and be enacted today, because the governor's public health emergency still has limitations on those counties based on their tests and their rates.
So the only way to supersede it would be through the governor's executive action.
Governor's executive action, that's correct.
So the second clarification
or the hospital or long-term care facility, they raise their standards, their procedures, the rigor with which they assess these things. They do have that power themselves to manage the ebbs and flows of this. But in terms of an absolute prohibition, the governor's powers, or if there were a federal law or a reg that were mandated. There's going to be some discussion later about this issue of how does this interact with federal guidelines and best practices. If anything in federal law or rule prescribes or overturns this, we understand in our compound republic that's kind of how it works. The department directive that has the effect of law trumps this.
Okay, so just real quick, the second piece, just for clarification, the 2 individuals for 2 hours, just reading it, I'm not sure if it strictly says these are 2 people that can't be interchanged. Sharing the 2 hours, is it 2 people for 15 minutes, 2 more people for another 15 minutes? What is the intent of having those 2 people for 2 hours?
Line 37 through 39, the patient shall have at discretion to change their essential caregiver. Line 38 says it, in accordance with reasonable guidelines established by the hospital or long-term care facility. So the hospital or long-term care facility decides how frequently that can change. Is it every week, every month, every day? I think if a hospital or long-term care facility said you can change it once every 6 months, I think it'd be hard to demonstrate that as being reasonable. But I think if they said once a week, it'd be hard to dispute that. I think that's why I want to give the power to the facilities to make those kinds of rules, to make sure that people are not taking advantage of the system.
Representative McDonald. Mr. Chairman, one of my questions is, what are your thoughts on bringing these caregivers, these 2 caregivers, into the ICU rooms with patients for these, I guess you would call them compassionate visits, or to be with that loved one for those 2 hours in these critical care rooms where the patients has critical COVID?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to hear testimony from physicians, attending physicians who, for years and years and years, we've had folks, hooked up to tubes and some really, really acute care circumstances in ICUs, and family members are still allowed in. I think and again, as I talk to members of my family who are in long-term care settings, when they go up into someone's room that's got coronavirus, they wear full PPE. They actually have a poncho even on top of their PPE. There are different procedures that are used to do that, and I think I would anticipate there'd be significantly more requirements. But again, we give those responsibilities to the hospital singularly to make those kinds of decisions. It's just the idea of stonewalling people. You can't come in and see grandma. That's the challenge. That's what we're trying to address.
And I get that. And that's kind of a preface to my next question. Okay. And I think Representative Kirby asked this in the beginning about the PPE and the cost and the providing of that. And that's a concern of whether it's assisted living, the long-term care facility, or even the hospital. What's the standard of what a family might be charged, or are they going to give it away? I just think that the cost be cost prohibitive for that.
Well, let me challenge that assumption. I mean, are we really saying that we as a legislature are going to be debilitated by the fact that a long-term care facility might require a mask and a face guard as a precondition to a family coming in? I don't think that's real. It's not a real impediment. I don't know what a face guard costs today. I would guess $30 or $40 for a good face guard and PPE. They might want an N95 mask that costs more. Those kinds of things are not, but the challenge is to allow hospitals or long-term care providers to say, you may not come in. Well, hey, I'm willing to buy an N95 mask. I'm willing to buy a face guard. I'm willing to pay for PPE. You still may not come in. I'm willing to take a PCR test. I'm willing to monitor my temperature. There's still circumstances in which they say, no matter what you do, no matter what you're willing to buy, you may not come in. And I think it's a red herring to say, oh, well, it's an unknown what those costs are going to be. We're debilitated and can't do this. That's just not true. That's not definitive on how we should act as a legislature. Those kinds of decisions are made all the time. I had to go get a PCR test paid for by me and my insurance before I could even have my own knee worked on as a patient. So I don't think it's not persuasive that the fact that I might be required to have a covered face mask or a mask or gloves is a deal killer for this. We can work through those things.
And that's my next statement is, as we've been getting emails and through our legislative emails, I've been calling families back to discuss House Bill 290.
Sure.
And pretty much 100% of the people I've talked with said they're willing to pay.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how we're setting this up, is they're willing to invest in coming to see their loved one. It means that much to them. One other last question is when we're talking about these essential caregivers, or two really, essential caregivers, and we're for liable damage. What when a hospital or a care facility said that when these essential caregivers break the rules, what protection is when they say you can't come in now because you broke the rules? Is there any protection for that facility that they can't be sued because you're not letting someone come in for breaking the rules?
Yeah.
And my last question is the long-term, these caregivers, currently aren't caregivers getting the part of the 1A vaccination? Deeming these caregivers, will that help them get the vaccination any sooner?
To my knowledge, there is no special status for essential caregivers as they've been defined in the other 5 states that have an essential caregiver program that moves them forward on the list. I know of none, and I would propose there's not one. If someone has information specifically with specific knowledge that's counter to that, let me know. I will. Your first question, though, addressed. Forgive me. The liability question. Yeah. Again, lines 40 through 41, where the facilities have the statutory power to establish reasonable safety requirements and to terminate or temporarily suspend. The only way the hospital isn't the sole determiner of that is if someone were to bring us a case and it would go to Superior Court of their county. And if someone went to the Superior Court in Forsyth County and your hospital, great public citizen, I think you've got a Northside Hospital in your community. If the Northside Hospital General Counsel went to the Superior Court judge and say, Your Honor, this person did this, they violated our procedure here, we gave them these warnings, they did this. I'm a believer that your Superior Court judge will look at the executive council of your hospital and say, you know, we're going to give you broad discretion to determine who gets to do what in your hospital. I don't think people will be able to bring cases that hurt your hospital. I think this reasonableness standard is fair. I think so. I think there's a law school debate about that. I think theoretically something can happen, but I think in practice, I think there will be broad discretion given to the providers since they're given sole discretion in law to determine that. I really do.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm going to ask every member, we have a lot of people here today visiting that want to speak, and we have a lot of members. So here's the deal going forward. Every member, one question. One question, and if you have another question, we'll come back around to it, making sure that everybody can speak. I do want to mention one thing that was asked by Representative McDonald. I would remind everyone here that as it relates to the cost of PPE, and again, I think it was explained by Chairman Setzler that you anticipate that would be a family expense in many cases, or in all cases. But I would remind you that the CARES Act funds have been provided to providers far and wide. Enormous sums of money have been provided to providers to cover the cost of PPE. So I just want to remind everyone of that. Representative McLeod.
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so let me just start by saying I completely understand this bill because it's very painful. I remember my daughter, she's 34 years old, last summer, she fell and actually cracked her skull. She's still my baby. And I dropped her at the hospital and I couldn't go in. And so when she woke up, she thought that she was abandoned. So I know this is a very important bill. The problem I'm having is COVID-19 is not a virus. It is not a virus that has any discrimination on age, political party, anything. It's a virus and its job is trying to survive. And by attaching itself to our body, it lives another day. And so for me, the vague idea of the reasonable standard, That's a problem for me in this bill. We need to be clear. Either we reference some CDC guidelines and PPEs, personal protective equipment, because leaving it up just to a facility, depending on the facility, there's some great ones, and then there's some ones that are shady. And these are people that we do love, and I know that the folks that are going to see them are already people that love them. So I really am concerned about the reasonable standard. And I do think that we have never mandated a mask in this state, which is something I've always had issue with the governor. This virus has had a longer life than it should. And with 11,000, over almost 15,000 people dead in our state, I don't want to have another death on my conscience because we passed a bill that could widen the range of people getting hurt and dying. So I really would like to see some more guidance on reasonable standard.
Appreciate the question. I would agree with you that it's important. I think the word that goes there or the words that go there are important. I would agree with your premise. We need to be careful that we put the right word in there. Now, we may or may not agree what that ought to be. The challenge with reasonableness is it sounds so informal, but it's actually legally in many cases it's kind of a coin of the realm. It is the balancing test that's used frequently and most appropriately. So I don't disagree with your premise. We need to, and if you want to explore that with me, we explore what that needs to be. I would tell you that's been carefully explored, and the reasonableness standards, we landed there intentionally, not by happenstance. Yeah, sure. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Representative Robichaux.
Thank you, and again, we all have had situations recently for various reasons, but I'm trying to understand the difference. So the administrative orders that our Department of Public Health put out under the governor's emergency orders, which were last updated October 8th of 2020. So if I read those, you know, it's very prescriptive in things that need to be done, testing, and a lot of it has to do with the facilities it's phased in based on the spread of the virus in their own communities, which we know is very important. We can discuss that. Do we have any idea, and it's phase 1, 2, and 3, 3 being people are allowed in with wearing masks, the facility can set those rules. Do we have any idea how many of our facilities across the state, that would include both long-term care facilities and our hospitals, are still in phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3? Are not even following these guidelines? Because these are the administrative orders. So
yeah, I think the department can absolutely answer that. I can't tell you county by county what that looks like.
right.
I would remind you this doesn't not go into effect until July of this year.
I understand.
So we'd be anticipating what that looks like.
Or do we expect DPH to come up with a new administrative order soon that would, and this mimics CDC guidelines also. So I'm just trying to understand.
I wouldn't want to speak for them, but I will tell you, as a matter of practice, as long as our public health state of emergency is in place, and the governor is prescribing that framework, Representative Robichaux, that's really going to trump this. I think as the governor steps back and says, okay, for these communities, we've eased up on them because of their public health outcomes, then this starts to have an impact, because if the public health emergency and those prescriptive requirements are removed, there's nothing that prohibits facilities in our state from prohibiting family members' access without this bill. And what this says is the default ought to be a fair, reasonable visitation regime is the standard. The governor could wipe it away if they wanted to. The current state of the law is it's up to the health care provider or the long-term care provider themselves to decide for themselves. And what that's done is it's put people in a circumstance where they have to choose between do I stay in the hospital and do what's in my medical best interest, or do I pull my family out to another setting that may not be as appropriate. And I don't think people should be at war with the system. I think the system needs to be fit together and integrated. And I think that's what this bill's trying to do.
I think we're all saying we all believe in that.
Yeah.
I guess I'm just trying to say these orders are in place, And if I read through them, like with a medical background, they seem to be reasonable. Are they difficult? Yes, I'm not going to deny that. But this is a unique time for all of us, so.
Okay. Representative Bazemore. Oh.
Thank you,
Try now.
Mr. Chair. Thank you, Representative, for bringing this issue to the forefront. And I just ditto what my colleagues have said about the seriousness of it and the concern that we all have with our loved ones. My question, however, is regarding line 19, where you say essential care workers, and it means individuals ages 18 years old or older. And the concern I have is because today, if you look at the Georgia Department of Health website, it states that the confirmed cases between the ages of 18 to 29 to date has been 173,941. Hospitalizations have been 3,195 and 90 deaths. That group, 18 to 29, has surpassed all other age groups. And so my concern is, first and foremost, how did you come to that age, 18 and older? And why would we now subject individuals that are already ill to possibly being severely?
Sure. Appreciate the question. I mean, you're getting into the question that Representative Bonner started with is, should there be any age distinction here? Would you, and this isn't a trick question. I mean, would you be more comfortable if we allowed people under the age of 18 to be part of this, or do you think it needs to be? Where would you suggest we go with it? Do you have any druthers there?
Frankly, I would not allow any age into this kind of setting. We are mandated every day here. We are not allowed to even have our aides in the building because they go and come. We can't trace them. We don't know where they've been, who they've been around. And so pretty much most of us are pretty healthy. Those in the hospital and long-term care are not. So that's why I would have concern allowing.
The reason, but to answer your question, the reason we said 18 years of old or older is because there's a level of responsibility there to follow procedures, to not take your mask off without being mindful and mature enough to understand it, to be being a responsible actor in that setting, to follow the rules and procedures. That's why we made it 18 years old or older. So again, and you can imagine a 20-year-old sibling with their 24-year-old sibling that's in the hospital. They may be the closest person to be able to relate to them. I wouldn't want to prohibit a 20-year-old from being able to do that. So,
Representative Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Chairman Setzler. And looking at the code, I'm just wondering, why would we codify this process instead of allowing the department and healthcare community to come up with a process that will protect the patients, visitors, and staff? Because once we put this in a code, it's going to take the General Assembly to come back in and correct it if we have another outbreak, we come up with another pandemic. It would take the General Assembly to come in to make changes to this. So why aren't we just allowing the departments and healthcare community to come up with the process that will protect the patients, visitors, and the staff?
Representative Scott, I appreciate the question. I would just redirect you to the case I shared before. You've got a 95-year-old lady in Evans, Georgia, who lived in a state You had a 95-year-old lady who lived in a state that allowed long-term care providers the sole discretion to make decisions about these kinds of issues. When you unpack that, you think, you ask the question, if our current legal status quo allows healthcare providers to say, no, you can't come in, and we see outcomes that shock the conscience like the one we saw, it certainly shocks my conscience, something needs to be done, in my opinion. That's why I'm very clear that what we're proposing in this is a mandate. 2 people, 2 hours a day. Because our current legal status quo allows providers and hospitals at their sole discretion to say you can't visit. And I think that violates people's human dignity. I think I hesitate to use the word right, but I think it approaches a right to be able to have contact with a loved one. I don't believe that people's medical condition that puts them in a place they need to be in a hospital should separate them from having access to their family. That's the circumstance we put them in. They have a choice between health care, acute care, or family members, and I think that's an assault on human dignity. And the status quo today allows those providers to make that decision themselves. I think that's too much. I think this calls on the General Assembly to act.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we still have a good number of questions here. We also have a couple of representatives that want to speak that are not on the committee. We also have a great number of citizens that want to speak. So we're going to continue. I have to present a bill briefly downstairs in Judiciary. I'm going to go do that right now and hand the chairmanship over to our secretary, Representative LaHood, and then I will be right back after presenting HB 168 downstairs. But I will tell you, I'm very excited that we have this much interest and great questions that are very important. Well, I heard, yeah. Today is a hearing only. This is an important matter. Every member needs to be educated on this issue, and then we will vote on it going forward.
And Mr. Chairman, I would ask, the pleasure of the chair, I would like to hear from all interested parties. Because I've asked the chair, if people that have anything other than the wholehearted support for this, that they come today and be heard. I've asked the chair if we can kind of get that kind of engagement.
Chairman, we expect everyone on both sides of the issue to come forward today and to tell us their concerns and their positions. We expect that. Correct. Representative LaHood, thank you.
All right, next we're going to hear from Representative Rebecca Mitchell, who's a member of this committee.
Thank you, and thank you for presenting this bill. I actually had a call on Thursday before I knew this bill was coming through the committee from a constituent who is 80, who is trying to see her mother, who is 104, in a local memory care facility. They're both vaccinated, and her mother got COVID as a result of being in the facility. And she asked what our policies were and why she hadn't been able to see her mother in a year. And I actually talked to her about this bill, and I talked to her about some of my questions that I still had for this bill, and hearing today has actually clarified some of that for me, because it sounds like right now this bill would not actually change whether she could see her mother, because we do have both the federal CMS guidelines that in Gwinnett we're still in the over 10% PCR positive zone, so she would not be able to see her mother. And we do have the executive order. So I'm a little bit concerned that what we're doing is making a long-term change to Georgia law based on our assumptions of this epidemic, but it won't provide the immediate relief that we're specifically looking for, because I think what we really need to see is a CMS revision of policies that do change our long-term care guidance for this epidemic. However, I would like to hear your thoughts on the impact this would have if we have an epidemic that comes through with completely different presentations. Say we have Ebola come back in Georgia. I'm really concerned that this is restricting facilities to a space where they would not have control when it could be fairly dangerous to the facility, the patient, and the families by taking that control away in the Georgia legislature.
Sure. No, I appreciate the question. I would remind you again, if there's a public health emergency, like a massive Ebola outbreak in Georgia, heaven forbid that would ever happen. Again, the governor's emergency power, public health emergency powers could eliminate this access provision of the new code section would create. And I would anticipate if it's in the circumstance with that level of severity that could likely happen. I think the challenge is, and the reason I think this is relevant moving forward, perhaps even as much as it would be relevant now to coronavirus in the next coming months, is what should the default condition be of people's right to visit their family members in the hospital, or family members' right to be visited by an essential caregiver that can help the medical team provide care. What this really means is in a standard condition, there is a right to visit family members or be visited by family members or essential caregivers that is sort of the foundation of Georgia, Georgia's delivery of hospital and long-term living arrangement services. It's really more about the long-term baseline than it is those acute conditions. Because when those acute conditions, the public health emergency like an Ebola or the early breakout of coronavirus comes around, we're not taking away the governor's emergency powers. So this really has more to do with the normal course of events or things like an influenza, spike, but not a pandemic. Those are the conditions in which we're really talking about in this bill. And I think it's so easy to be over attentive to right now or the last couple of months of coronavirus. I think it's instructive that there's no accountability, there's no ability to advocate by a family member to overcome a hospital or long-term care provider's objection. They simply have to take it. This sort of changes the default condition. But in those very severe circumstances, the governors and their powers for public health emergencies would be unchanged, and they would continue to be able to control access to these facilities. And this bill would have no effect on that.
Okay, thank you. Next, we have Representative Byrd.
All right. Thank you very much, Chairman Setzler, for bringing this bill. First, I have to say that it's a sad day that we have to sit here to make the decisions of people not being able to go and visit family wherever they may be. So that's one point. The other one, I'm trying to get my head around this because I would assume, and one never assumes anything, that there are standards for healthcare providers, workers, going in and out of a facility, going in and out of a hospital, so there has to be standards for them. They go into the hospital, they take care of those patients, they leave, they go to dinner, they see their kids. I mean, sure. All of these people are out there, and if they are in a lockdown situation, as long-term cares are, hospitals, the only people that are bringing in anything are those healthcare workers, providers.
Employees, yes.
Correct. So for a family member to be able to go in to visit, they should be under the same standards as any healthcare worker provider. They have been outside, they have been around, and do the temperature, do whatever is necessary, take care of their mask, etc. So I'm just trying to understand why a healthcare worker provider is any different than a family member or a caregiver that needs to go in to see their member and give them the love, the nurturing, the care that they need?
That question goes right to the heart of the issue. And it's so easy to think about, essential workers, employees as being essential, and this being this frivolous extension. The irony is, under current law, or under a current framework, my 22-year-old son has not had coronavirus. He works as an employee in a long-term care facility. Okay, he would be allowed in, even though not having had coronavirus before. He could become contagious and pass it on to somebody. I, who've had coronavirus within the last 6 weeks, am not contagious, but I could be prohibited from being in that environment because I would, even though I'm not contagious and couldn't pass it on to someone else, I'm not an employee, and I'd be turned away at the door just by virtue of my status. It has nothing. It's not. It doesn't address the issue of someone's risk for contagion. It's simply how they're positioned relative to the delivery of healthcare services. If they're an employee of the healthcare provider, they get to live their life and take their tests and put on their equipment or their PPE and go in and interact with anyone in any setting. But somebody that may be way safer, may have way lower risk by virtue of their being positioned as a non-employee, but an essential family caregiver, they can be turned away for any or no reason. That's your point. It doesn't address the issue of real public health because it doesn't take a person-by-person risk assessment. It's simply how they're positioned as a W-2 employee or simply a visitor. And I think your question goes right to the heart of the issue, which is why we raised this. We need to be about real outcomes, real health care, real science. And I think as we dig deeper into the question, we find exactly what you just said is the case. Thank you.
Okay, next we have Representative Bonner.
Hey, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Follow-up question on, are you aware of any exception, or does this contemplate any exception for clergy, priest, a pastor, any of those that would not be necessarily on a list, but obviously in these situations where it's either an end-of-life situation or just an extreme
yes,
traumatic event?
That question's been brought to me, and that's a very fair one. Should healthcare providers, long-term care providers, if we establish the system, should they be able to designate people as essential caregivers that have no relational link to an individual? Should it be a chaplain, for example, that can serve an entire facility? I believe that would be a great addition. I've not tried to get into that because I've not explored the details of how you define that. But I do think it's a fair question. And, as this moves forward, there may be a role for that. What I don't want to do is, in trying to solve this issue of familial contact as essential caregivers, I don't want to create I don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good and trying to create that. But I think it's a very fair question that we may need to think about moving forward because there are people like chaplains and clergy. I think under the definition here, if there's a chaplain or a clergyman that has a relationship to an individual, they could designate their pastor to come in for a period of time as one of their caregivers. But again, there's some clunkiness to that because you're limited to two, and how does that play out versus family members? So I'd be open to some ideas. We've thought about it, but this bill does not address that at all.
All right, next we have a couple of representatives who are not on the committee who have requested to speak. And first, we're going to go to Representative Bentley.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the members of this committee for your consideration of House Bill 290. And I won't go into so much detail as the chairman has stated already regarding the bill. I just want to share with you my reasons of supporting House Bill 290. And I know all of you in this room, for the sake of time, I won't go into so much detail, know about my situation with my husband. At the end of 2018 session, I left session, and on May 3rd, I not only became a state legislator and a wife and a mother, but I became an essential caregiver. And I have been an essential caregiver for my husband since May 3rd, 2018, as we have been into various hospitals all across this state, Macon, Atlanta, Augusta, and now we are in Savannah. On December 27th, he ended up in the hospital and was tested positive for COVID. And that was in Macon, and now he's down in Savannah. And when he was came out of COVID ICU, I was able to visit him. I went into the hospital. The hospital, before I can come through the door, I had only one entrance of the hospital that I could come into. They checked my temperature. They gave me a mask. They asked me a series of questions before I was permitted to go to the floor to see him. And I was the only person that could go and see him, not other family members. He was only one person. And I had a chance to visit with him for a few hours for 2 days while I was in town. Last Friday, he was transferred from critical care to a specialty hospital to try to work on removing the trach, the ventilator, the feeding tube, and the fact that he's on dialysis. And last Friday, on my way from Taylor County to Savannah, I was talking with 3 different caseworkers, really wanting him to go to a facility that will allow me to be able to visit with him, that the facility that I really wanted did not, unfortunately, have a bed available that day, because the hospital that he was in said that the insurance says now he's in a position that he needs to be moved to another level of care, because we need this room for more critical care of patients. And so the facility that I really wanted him to go into, Mr. Chairman, would have allowed me to visit with him, would have allowed 2 family members to visit with him within a time frame of 3 hours. Now, how that was broken down was the 2 of us couldn't be in the room for a total of 3 hours. If we came down to Savannah from Taylor County, if 2 of us came down, I could come on Friday for within that time span, and then the next day, the next family member could come. Both of us couldn't be in the room at the same time. But the mere fact that we could visit, that's why I wanted him to be able to go to that facility. But unfortunately, because that facility didn't have a room available that day, we had to go to another facility that does not require any visitors. But what I found so interesting, that all 3 facilities are less than 5 miles apart in the same city, but that's their requirements. And as back to 2018, since my husband been in the hospital, I've been with him every step of the way. But to be denied the opportunity to visit with him now really breaks my heart. And I asked you, the members of this committee, to please just search your heart and think about the position these family members are in, your colleague that you work with every day, what I'm dealing with the fact that I can't be there with my husband. And he's in a position now, the last time he spoke was December 30th, and today is what? February 10th. And so he cannot advocate on his own behalf. He can't say what's going on with him, and he can't speak on his behalf to tell what his real concerns are. But as his essential caregiver, I would love to have that opportunity to be there. So I thank you for your work on this bill. And those, again, I just ask that you all just really just take a moment, just search deep down in your heart about where we are right now, and how having that family member present with these patients, just hearing their voice, I believe will give them the motivation to fight harder, to get well. And it would give family members like me a better feeling when I go to bed at night, knowing that I had a chance to at least hold my husband's hand, even if he can't talk to me, because this has really been tough on me these past few weeks, and I thank all of you for your support. But there's a lot of families across this state that's in the exact same position. And so I ask that you will humbly please just search your heart and think long and hard about your support to this legislation. So thank you.
Thank you, Representative Bentley, for sharing that personal story.
Absolutely, thank you.
Okay, next we have Representative Gilligan, who's going to speak with us virtually.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this opportunity, and I appreciate being able to speak to this bill that Chairman Setzler has brought today. As Representative Bentley was talking about, there are times in our lives when we become the primary caregiver for our family member. Like her in 2018, I also experienced being the primary care provider for my husband while he was in the hospital recovering from major surgery. I was the one who got him out of the bed. I was the one who ensured he got the walks that he needed. I was the one who got him ice water when he needed it, because that's what an essential care provider does. And it eased the staff, the hospital staff, because even in days of pre-COVID, there were times that the hospital staff could not get there to do what I was doing. So I like to think that not only was I a help to my husband, I was a help to the hospital. Also, like many of you, I have said my final farewell to several family members. The most recent one was the only one who died of COVID. She had been in a long-term care facility that had not had any COVID breakouts until recently. It wasn't because of visitation that she caught COVID. It was brought in by either an employee or a contract worker there at the facility. I'm not mad at the facility because I know it's a virus and it will travel because that's what it does. I want to thank that particular facility because in their compassion, they did allow one of my loved one's family members to come in and spend time with her during her final days. The fact that a family member was able to go in is a great blessing, but it also reveals that family members can safely visit their loved ones in these facilities without causing a spread of the disease. There has been no increase in this particular facility because of the visitation that my great aunt received. So I just want to thank the chairman. I want to thank the members of this committee for giving this legislation all the due diligence that it needs. I know that this committee will perfect the bill, and I look forward to being able to cast a vote in favor of the final product. And thank you, Chairman LaHood, for allowing me to speak to this committee today.
And thank you, Representative Gilligan, for sharing. All right, next we have some citizens that have requested to speak, and some are here in person, or some are going to join us virtually. And we're going, because of time, the sake of time, we have a lot of people that want to speak. I'd like to ask the citizens to limit your remarks to within 3 minutes. And so first we're going to go to Ms. Karina Yakomovich, and she's joining us virtually.
Thank you, Secretary LaHood, for letting me speak, and thank you so much, Representative Setzler, for so passionately sharing my mother's story. And I know that everyone has heard it and everyone has seen it, but I just wanted to touch on a few parts, how important this is to me, because I really am part of my mother's healthcare team. When I go to spend time with my mother prior to COVID-19, I'm cleaning her dentures, I'm putting lotion on her body, I'm cutting her fingernails and her toenails, I'm helping to change her diapers. I help to feed my mother. She has dementia. Sometimes she forgets how to use a fork or a knife or a spoon. I take her outside and I push her around the facility for fresh air and for sunlight. I play bingo with her to help stimulate her mind. I sing songs with her. I bring her flowers. I bring her her favorite treats, if you will. I bring her clothes, toiletry items. I do so much for the care of my mother while I am there. It's just not a casual visit. I'm trying to love on her and stimulate her and help her, which is helping the staff. When I show up, the staff is free to go and spend more time with other residents and other patients. I'm just begging everyone here to please, as so many others have expressed, to reach down in your hearts and think about this situation. My mother is being forced into this isolation and this separation from her family. She's not a prisoner. I mean, she shouldn't be treated as a prisoner. She's committed no crime here, and she is on borrowed time. I just ask that you please show your support for this bill. And I ask it on behalf of thousands of other family members here in the state of Georgia who I know are in the same situation, if not worse. I appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Yakomovich. Appreciate you sharing your personal story with us, and our heart goes out to you, and we're going to do everything we can to get this issue right. All right, next we have...
Thank you so much.
Yes, ma'am. Next we have a citizen, Monica Goldsmith. Is she with us in person? She may be in the hallway. Monica Goldsmith. Okay. All right, come on up, Ms. Goldsmith. Oh, you're going to, all right, you're going to stand back there. All right, go ahead. See if it's turned on.
Okay. My name is Monica Goldsmith, and I live in Decula, Georgia. I'm a registered nurse, and I worked for 9 years in a hospital setting. My father is 95 years old. Last April, he fell and broke his hip and was taken to a hospital nearby. He had hip surgery that went well, but his recovery was very difficult. He was on pain medicine and became very confused and uncooperative. My sisters and I called him every day, but we were not allowed to go into the hospital to see him. I lived 10 minutes away from the hospital and would have gone to see him frequently. It didn't help that my dad is very hard of hearing, so our phone conversations were very difficult. Sometimes his meal tray was left on the table, but he couldn't reach it. The nurses are very busy, and it would have been helpful if I could have been there to help him eat. He lost about 20 pounds and became very weak. We talked to doctors and nurses often about his care, but I could have been a lot more helpful with his care if I could have gone in to see him, to be his advocate. He then went to a rehab center where we also couldn't visit him. The care was very poor there, so after numerous phone calls, we had him transferred to a much better rehab facility. Once there, I was allowed to visit him, so I brought him snacks that he likes to eat to help put weight on him. He was thrilled to see a family member after being alone for several weeks. He is now living in an assisted living facility, and they have not allowed visitors for the last few weeks. He's gotten so weak that he can't get out of bed, but his mind is still very sharp. I'm very thankful that we've had the opportunity to see my dad in the past few months, but I know there are countless stories of people who haven't seen their elderly family members since March. When the elderly can't have visitors from family and friends, there's no accountability for the staff. Sometimes the caregivers are great, and sometimes they aren't. My dad has said numerous times that he would rather die of COVID than not have visitors. I know that my dad doesn't have a long time left to live because of his age and the shape that he's in, and it is a tragedy that he has to be alone at the end of his life. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Goldsmith, and I know your story is just one of many that are similar, and we're going to hear from a couple of more. Lori Ballington should be in the hallway if she could make her way in. And next, if Deborah Malone could be ready after Ms. Ballington, and if Dale Garner is here with us, they will be next. And then after these citizens, we'll hear from some advocacy groups. First the Department of Community Health, then advocacy groups, then some providers. So, Ms. Ballington.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak to each one of you today. I know that I'm just one of many with a similar story, but I appreciate you being able to listen to me today because my family has felt very helpless during this last year of COVID, of not knowing what to do and how to take best care of our loved one that I'm going to be speaking about. I know that at some point in all of our lives, we are all going to be faced with being in a hospital or having a loved one in a hospital. And it's always a unique situation, and the timing is never what we would want. And we have all experienced in some way, shape, or form this past year of trying to balance out how to do that during a pandemic. But when you're in a position of being in a place like this with a loved one, you are extremely vulnerable and exposed, and most of the time, very, very frightened. These facilities that we're talking about, they work best when the staff, patient, and patient's advocate work together as a team. Each of these team members has a vital role in taking care of the patient and resident. There are many facets that each team member brings to this game of life. Each member is an MVP. We, for a year now, have been fielding an incomplete healthcare team. We have left out the heart and soul of the team that provide hope, the patient's advocates. We can never underestimate the positive power the physical presence of a loved one provides. The patient advocate also provides vital insight, if we have heard, to the medical staff. I believe my family's story highlights the need for this bill so we can once again provide the best care and not provide, as Representative Settler says, that juxtaposition of do I go get health care or do I stay with a loved one? If I could plan my own death, and I know I can't, I would plan together to be with my loved ones. In 2019, I was able to be with my father-in-law along with many loved ones as he passed away in a hospital. What made that a special and unique time is that we were able to plan with the healthcare providers and be with him every step of the way. And it was a special and unique time. It was very difficult, but together we were able to do it. I can remember being able to hold his hand and be with him as he told me in his very special way, "Lori, I love you. Go get me some ice cream." And I knew that that's what he needed. But when he passed away, we had to put my mother-in-law in an assisted living facility because she suffers from dementia and she also is very medically fragile. And in the last year, I have not been able to touch my mother-in-law. And we cannot remove her from the situation that she is in. In fact, she is receiving palliative care right now. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with what palliative care is. It falls under hospice care, and we measure her life in months, not years now. And anyone who has an experience with this, it's very difficult. We have a palliative care team that's supposed to be able to get into her assisted living facility. But for the past year, none of those team members except for one has been able to be in that facility. She's supposed to have someone to help her eat because she forgets to eat, and they're not allowed to be in there at all either. We have been able to be in the facility, not in it, have some socially distant visits, but they're very sporadic. It's at the discretion of the facility. And as we stated before, the only cases that have been in there have been brought in not by visitors, but by staff. And as the representative who posted her talked on the screen, I don't hold that against them. They're doing the best they can. I just want an opportunity to see my mother-in-law and to be able to provide for her what we were able to provide for my father-in-law. I will tell you that between March and June, she's gone from 120 pounds to 87 pounds. She's 5'10". She's wasting away because she does not care about life. And I want to be able to give her that opportunity to be able to provide for her the love and attention she deserves. As we've been talking about, there is a fate worse than death. That is a loss of who we are as human beings. And being able to be with loved ones when they're at their most vulnerable is basic to who we are as human beings. Please help all of us restore this most basic human, I would say it's a right, to be able to help us all during this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ballington, for sharing your story and for honoring your mother by being here today. Is Deborah Malone with us? Ms. Malone.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. And I'm coming from a little different place. I have a daughter that is in community living arrangement. And even in the executive order, when he was doing the soft phases, the community living arrangements were left out. So there was no chance of me to visit at all. And this is my daughter, and she's 43, but she functions on a 6-year level. I haven't seen her in a year. I took care of her until she was 38. And, you know, when she went into the group home, I was there 3 or 4 times a day. I mean, not day, 3 or 4 times a week. And I was her advocate. And one thing about the families is they know their loved one better than anybody. The nuances I know of Nikki, nobody else knows. I've saved her life twice because I knew something was wrong, but they didn't. I mean, just the tiniest things I can pick up on and know something is not right. And the last time I encouraged them, I kept encouraging them, something's wrong, and they said, well, she's responding to us, but I knew something wasn't right. By the time we got her to the hospital, she had double pneumonia and sepsis and wasn't even expected to live. She was in intensive care for 7 days. I got to stay with her every day in intensive care. Of course, this was all before COVID. We are their voice. We are their advocates. And Nikki doesn't understand, you know, why her mother can't come see her. I don't understand why I can't go see her. The pain and the depression that goes with it is at times unbearable. There aren't even words to tell you how I feel at times. And it's the same with Nikki. I missed Christmas. Her birthday was December 28th. I've never missed one of her birthdays. I had to miss her birthday. She kept asking me, was I coming? And I tried to explain to her, but she didn't understand. She just knew her mother wasn't coming to celebrate her birthday with her. I asked the agency if we could do a drive-by and just let Nikki be outside and some of the friends and stuff just wave to her or whatever. I was not allowed to do that. And I was told I can bring her presents and put them on the porch and that they would give them to her. And something else, like some of the concerns that I've heard, Nikki and I both have had our shots, but the facility workers are allowed, when they go home, to go anywhere they want to go, do anything they want to do, and they have even been allowed to not take the shots. And they can come back in and work with Nikki, and they work with her very close. But her mother can't come in and see her. To me, there is no difference. There is no difference. There's many things I do for Nikki. Like I've heard other people say, I clip her fingernails, I clip her toenails. She needs social stimulation. They don't have time to do that. When I go, I read to her, I play games with her, and this keeps her mind going. I do her exercises. I help her do exercises. They will not do them because of liability at the home. So I had worked with her about a year. Her arms had gotten stiff. And it took me about a year to work with her where she could move them. Now it's been a year with no exercises. And where is she? She's back stiff, like this, because that's how she sits, and nobody helps her move her arms. Some days are better than others, but there's not a day that goes by I don't long to see Nikki. If anything were to happen to either one of us, and Nikki's on borrowed time, and I don't know if I'll be here tomorrow. We don't know. That's a whole year that I missed being with her. So I'm asking that if there are some concerns, that you can work with this bill and work those concerns out one way or the other so that we will be able to go see our loved ones.
Thank you, Ms. Malone. Appreciate you being here with us. Looks like Chairman Petrie is rejoining. And is there a Dale Garner here? Dale Garner? Okay. Next, I believe we have Debbie Gwaltney. Is Debbie Gwaltney here? Come on up to the mic. Before you start, Ms. Gwaltney, let me just remind everyone we want to keep comments to within 3 minutes, if at all possible.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman and fellow representatives, my name is Debbie Gwaltney. I'm from Ringgold, Georgia, Catoosa County, and I appreciate the opportunity to address you today about HB 290. I might have a bit of a unique perspective. I've been the patient caregiver, and I've also been the professional nurse at the bedside. Today I want to speak to you about my experiences as the nurse. I work nights in a large public hospital, 6 patients a shift with minimal support staff. Family visitors are not visitors, they're essential care partners, even and perhaps especially at night. I had a young patient for many weeks who was dying from tuberculosis, which, as you know, is an extremely contagious respiratory illness. This patient was isolated in a negative pressure room with a separate ventilation system. The door to her room was always closed and only briefly open for people to enter or exit. Anyone entering the room was required to don and doff PPE, an N95 mask, gowns, gloves, the whole 9 works. This is extremely time-consuming, and while we did the best that we could to consolidate her care, there were many times when it would be literally hours in between visits from nurses and other staff. Fortunately, her parents were by her bedside. They were invaluable to her care. They bathed and fed their daughter, they exercised her limbs, and they helped to monitor her general condition. They pushed the call button for her when she could not. They alerted the nurses when she was in pain and struggling with such anxiety that she could not control her actions, and they alerted us when her breathing was deteriorating. Luckily, her parents were there, and she could feel the touch of their hands and see their faces. They had been estranged from their daughter, but they were able to heal those wounds during those last weeks of her life. They were with each other in their most vulnerable moments, and she died in her mother's arms. And I know this is an extreme example, but the truth is it is almost impossible to provide safe patient care without bedside partners, family advocates. Family members are there to advocate for their loved ones, to act as nursing assistants, and to even be translators. It's extremely difficult to find a translator at 2 o'clock in the morning with someone who speaks a very rare dialect of Spanish because they're Peruvian. They help to improve patient outcomes. They even help prevent patient accidents and deaths. They lower the injury rates and decrease work burdens and stress on nurses and other staff who are also suffering terribly from this lack of bedside partner care. I absolutely cannot imagine being the nurse who has to make that phone call day in and day out, telling people that their loved one has 30 minutes or an hour until they pass away. Our nursing system is so broken at this point, and it's because we do not have the essential person there, the caregiver. And on just one other note, as the caregiver, I was my dad's caregiver for the last 4 years of his life. At one point, my dad was he was allergic to almost every antibiotic out there. At one point, he went into the emergency room, he was not conscious, and when I got there, he would not even answer me. They gave him vancomycin, or almost gave him vancomycin, which is an antibiotic that would have killed him almost instantly. It was written on the computer screen that he was deathly allergic to vancomycin, and yet they were going to give him that medication. If I hadn't been there, and I am telling you, I nearly leapt across that bed, if I had not been there to stop them, they would have killed my father, and we would have never, ever known why.
Thank you, Ms. Gwaltney. We're out of time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's so important. I'm going to tell we have a good number of citizens that are here to speak. We want to hear you first. We will have, but in order to do that, the only way to do that is to limit your time. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to ask you to say what we need to hear in 1 minute, okay? That's very important because we don't want to miss anybody, and otherwise we will lose an opportunity to hear from folks that we need to hear from. All right, is Miss Brittany Ellison in the room? Oh, I'm sorry, is that I'm sorry, Miss Ellison. I'm trying to catch citizens first. You're with an organization. I'm sorry, I apologize. Miss Susan Austin in the room. Miss Susan Austin, Miss Charissa Rumsey. If you'll be on deck, Miss Rumsey. Okay. Do we have Miss Austin?
Right here.
Okay, Miss Rumsey, you're on deck. Is that the last of the? Okay. All right.
Okay.
And as you may not have heard, Miss Austin, 1 minute.
Okay.
Thank you.
I won't try to read anything, obviously, in 1 minute. I will just say, in November and December of this year, my husband's battle with cancer came to a point where he needed medical care. He needed to go to the hospital. And I'm so grateful for the fact that the hospital I chose was one in our area that actually allowed visitors. I'm here to say 4 hours a day I was allowed by myself to go and see my husband. And you might be wondering, well, what are you here complaining about? And I just want to say there were numerous times in those hours that I was there that I advocated for my husband, for pain medicine, for food, for comfort things. I was able to encourage him, hold his hand, and I can't tell you how invaluable that was to him and it was to me. So I strongly encourage you to think about these people and the families and what they're going through. I don't know how much time I have left, but I was an advocate for him in so many ways. I just can't tell them to you in a minute. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miss Austin. That's extremely helpful. Miss Rumsey, are there any other citizens here to speak? Okay, if you would be on deck, ma'am, if you would stand ready. Miss Rumsey, 1 minute.
I come here today with a little bit different perspective. As the owner of a facility, I'm here to talk about what we have done to our seniors. One of the biggest things that we are missing, and I'm going to talk a little just personally. My grandmother was one of our residents who lived at our facility for 6 years. Her very last words to me were, "I love you." And I was there to hear them. We are robbing families of those moments. But more than that, we as caregivers and we in this industry are tired. We're exhausted. We need family help.
Families are the first step in the watchdogs of our industry. Since COVID began, I have seen nothing but care quality go down in our industry. And it is because we do not have the watchdogs in there helping us. We don't have families telling us, hey, I saw this, did you know this? I don't know if you know, but one of your medical providers came in without a mask on. It enables us as owners to do a better job. So I am asking that you consider allowing this bill to go through and allowing us as providers to have a better quality of care for our residents.
Thank you so much, Ms. Rumsey. Thank you so much. We have one last citizen presenter, and please state your name, ma'am, in 1 minute, please.
Good afternoon. Excuse me. Good afternoon. My name's Laura Simonelli. This is a humanitarian issue. It's a humanitarian issue. They don't have a voice. The seniors don't have a voice. Did anyone go and decide, like they were 2 years old?
Ms. Simonelli, please speak into the microphone if you could. That would be helpful.
I said, this is a humanitarian issue. No one went and asked people in these facilities if they wanted their families over a possible risk of a virus. They just didn't. My mom knows Christ. She's 81 years old. I brought pictures. So, this is my mother. She has lost 20 pounds. She calls me daughter now. She doesn't call me Lori. She calls me daughter. My son is her favorite. He's 30. On her birthday, she didn't know who he was. She doesn't know any of our middle names anymore. They gave me a compassionate care visit. Here it is. Per CMS guidelines, that's a compassionate care visit. They told me I wasn't allowed to feed her because it wasn't in the guidelines. She weighs 99 pounds. 99 pounds. She's 5'6½". She likes to sing. So she used to sing that at 81 years old, she'd sing, "How great thou art with me," through a window. She's hard of hearing. I stand through glass this thick. And she used to sing Amazing Grace and How Great Thou Art, and her mind doesn't bring them anymore. And then she went to Jesus Love Me. And so I would come and knock on the window, and she'd say, "It's my daughter." And I'd sing Jesus Love Me with her. And this last Thursday, she could not call the words. Isolation is worse than COVID. Please pass this bill as a mercy to our seniors. They deserve better.
Thank you, Ms. Simonelli. That completes our public citizen comments, and then we have, well, we're going to, these are, all right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to now go to the Department of Community Health. I think we have Joe Hood on remote. We're going to let the department speak next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We can hear you fine.
Great. Great. First of all, Mr. Chairman, what I want to say is the department, my next commentary is meant to be educational and pointing out the guidance and how we work at the department and the concerns and conflicts that we see. It is by no means meant to minimize any of the testimony we've heard today, and certainly we understand this issue and understand how meaningful it is. So with that, what I'd like to do is to go through and point out that in Georgia, and specifically I'm speaking to the nursing homes and hospitals, which was in the original bill, 97% of the hospitals and nursing homes are federally certified, 178 of the 182 hospitals and 358 of the 368 nursing homes. and they're subject to CMS rules and regulations, primarily due to their Medicare and Medicaid funding and the certification therein that allows for that primary funding source. Failure to adhere to the CMS guidance means that they most likely would lose that Medicare or Medicaid funding. And additionally, there are many private insurance plans that will not contract with those facilities if they were to be decertified. So specifically, the department is concerned that where there is the line and there's the discussion about the inclusion of safety regulations, that there's not due deference and explicit reference to CMS federal regulation. And given that CMS would regulate, it would be our concern that if this were to pass, that it still would not have meaningful influence on those facilities due to their funding and due to their need to comply with CMS regulation. And listening to Representative Setzler, it sounded as if he may be giving deference to that, but it would be our concern that there be explicit language that allow for those. We provided the committee copies of the guidance from CMS that exist for the hospitals and the nursing homes. Explicitly, I think those many of those have been referenced already. It requires that there be a determination of how large an outbreak there is in a facility, the number of total visitors in the facility, the local county positivity rate, and that they have minimum staffing to address the needs and the standards of care within the facility. So I think our primary concern there is that there's deference to those guidelines so that there's meaning to the state statute, because as my understanding, the federal regulations in those instances would trump. Now, in reference to the substitute and the state facilities, that would not, of course, be the case. Although we would, look at some of those same rules and regulations as we look at the safety requirements of the state facilities, personal care homes, assisted living, and certainly as it goes to staffing for due care. The next item that I'd like to address is the additional challenge that is out there within the hospitals and within the facilities for staffing, and to make sure there's an awareness by the committee. And I certainly am aware that Representative Setzler was referencing, for this pandemic with the executive order, this may not have impact, but there would need to be consideration for staffing. And certainly during the pandemic, those facilities, both the nursing homes, assisted living, personal care homes, and hospitals, have huge limitations on staffing. As an example, at the height of the pandemic in September, the department, through CARES funding, was supporting over 100 nursing homes to achieve minimum nursing staffing, and over 60 hospitals throughout the state of Georgia to provide nursing assistance so that there would be minimum standards of care to address COVID patients. And still here today, we have staffing augmentation through CARES funding in over 70 hospitals throughout the state to address COVID care, and over 40 nursing homes. And I bring that up to state that under the CMS guidelines, they have to maintain in the hospital level and in the nursing home a minimum staffing requirement for standards of care. Now, I'll leave it to facilities to address what this policy and what this bill would mean in regards to additional staffing that may be required, but certainly there would be some component of that for safety policy and procedure, for donning and doffing of PPE, for temperature tests, for whatever may be required in the different scenario for the visitation. So that would be a concern. And of course, it would also be a concern in the state-run facilities, although they do not have the same federal guidance that they would have to adhere to. They certainly would have the same safety regulations that the department would feel obligated to hold them to for staffing standards of care, regardless of whether there's visitation or not. The last thing that I wanted to address, and I think this is a known quantity already and has been addressed, but the immunity that is there, that's explicit in the bill, of course, is not going to be helpful to the nursing homes and hospitals if they violate federal regulation. Federal regulations, particularly as it goes to staffing, if there's a determination that rises to an immediate jeopardy, to a place where it places other residents at harm or the resident at harm, there would be movement by CMS to require a corrective action plan. And if that is not in place, of course, in some instances, that would mean loss of certification, and in some dire instances, of course, closure of a facility. So those are our concerns. Those are what we wanted to point out within the bill to bring forward to the committee. I'm happy to answer questions. I do want to emphasize again, we certainly understand the need for this type of discussion and the concerns that are raised, and are by no means want to undermine any of the testimony that's come forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Hood. Are there any questions for Mr. Hood from committee members at this time? Okay, there being none, thank you, Mr. Hood. Very helpful. Well, wait a second. Mr. Hood, we have one question, and we'll attempt to keep it brief in the light of other testimony that we have today. All right, Representative McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Hood, and thank you, Chairman. Thank you for coming on and making it clear. It's not just about just the family. It's about the spread of this virus. And it's so important for us to keep that in mind all the time, and the requirements to minimize the spread. I certainly support the families, and I do think that we can work through this to get a really good bill that works for everyone and protects the public. And we lack traceability in the state, so we need to consider all of that. So I thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you again to the department. Okay, we're going to move on now to another group of presenters. I'm going to ask everyone to be very brief. In particular, if there's folks here that are going to say something that has already been said, I would ask you to make it even more brief. And so let's begin with the Family Policy Alliance of Georgia. That's Ms. Brittany Ellison. And again, as short as possible. Thank you, Ms. Ellison.
I'm with Family Policy Alliance of Georgia, and we are in very strong support of this bill. My inspiration for working so hard on this bill with Representative Setzler is my friend Abby, who is a nurse. She couldn't be here today, but she wrote a very short letter, I promise, that she asked me to read. She says, I apologize that I could not be in attendance this afternoon. I am currently working down at the hospital in the oncology unit. One of the reasons why I wanted to become a nurse was because the bond of the nurses have with their patients and their families is very important to me. But I wouldn't have imagined that I would be playing the role of both nurse and family. While working on the floor, I have seen the strain on my patients both mentally and emotionally because they are unable to see their loved ones. In my very first week on the floor, my patient died alone in his room. He was never able to see his family. It is heartbreaking to see patients fighting for their lives but unable to have any family fighting alongside them. Cancer is an aggressive disease for the patients to endure, and I believe that no one should ever have to fight that alone. I understand the current climate and the risk of COVID, but for some patients, this is the least of their worries. If a patient is near the end of their life and struggling alone, it is inhumane to deny them the ability to have a loved one by their side. No one deserves to die alone in a hospital bed with or without the risk of COVID. I hope you will consider this bill because being together in a time of crisis benefits both the patients and their families. Thank you, Abigail. And as y'all have heard from many people today, the inability to see loved ones in a hospital and nursing home takes a major toll on patients, families, and healthcare workers. We were not created as people to be alone, especially in vulnerable situations. This has become a humanity issue. It should never have gotten this far. And you on the committee can play a key role in helping loved ones be back together. And I hope that you will keep that in mind and vote in favor of HB 290. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ellison. Dr. McCormick. Is Dr. McCormick in the room? Dr. McCormick. Thank you, sir, for being here.
My pleasure. So I'm Dr. Rich McCormick. I'm an emergency medicine physician. Matter of fact, I'll be working the next 4 nights on the floor, so I hope I don't see any at work. But I thought it was very important to show up today and state my case as a healthcare provider who probably sees more COVID than most people. Before that, I was an ER doc. I was a military veteran for 20 years, so the rights that we have as individuals are very near and dear to me, and I would die for them. I've treated more COVIDs than most other doctors and those other specialties, so I think I have some expertise in this situation. And I've witnessed firsthand the impact of the critical patients not having access to their families. Let me be clear, about 3 million people will die in America this year. About 3 million people died last year, and 3 million will die the next year. The vast majority of those people will not die of COVID. Yes, a lot of people will die of COVID, but realize that people are dying every year, whether we have a pandemic or not, and about the same number of people will die this year. You may have an uptick, but it's going to be critical people dying of critical diseases every single year, and the question is, how do we die of these diseases? That's what's really concerning me right now. One of the most unfortunate and tragic side effects of this pandemic is the separation of families during this critical and end-of-life moments. Although well-meaning, visitation rules are robbing patients and families of their humanity, and often, instead of protecting us from death, are robbing us of life. Here's the irony. There is no evidence that an asymptomatic person or a visitor with the proper protective gear results in more death and disease. However, there is real evidence that from the time you are born to the time that you die, that your physical and emotional health is directly linked to your access to your family and loved ones. The fact is, every patient will die eventually, as will every visitor, as will everybody in this room. So the question is, will we be allowed to live or die with dignity? Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, Doctor. Miss Suzanne Gay with 40 Days for Life. Are you here, ma'am? Okay.
Thank you so much to the legislators, to everybody here in this room for your time, sacrifice, and consideration. I am here representing a mother's heart. Her name is Gail Murkison. I will do my best to speak quickly, but please allow me the time to share this mother's heart as I'm representing her voice. On April 29th, 2020, one day after her birthday, my daughter Emily, 26 years old, and her boyfriend were riding automatic skateboards across a crosswalk. As she was crossing, a car hit her and knocked her approximately 10 yards. The driver then ran over my daughter. She was taken to a hospital and listed as Jane Doe. Her boyfriend was not allowed in due to the hospital's policy on COVID. When I reached the hospital, I was told the same. No visitors allowed. Emily listed myself and my sister, who is a PA, as authorized family members involved in her care. Emily was admitted to ICU with multiple fractures that included left femur and ankle, tibia, pelvic fractures, and spinal fractures, and a pneumothorax and right scapula fractures. She had road burns all down her right side. She could only use her right arm with limited range. These are just a few of her injuries. She had surgery on April 29th and April 30th. On April 29th, she was scheduled for surgery early that morning. At 6 a.m., the orthopedic doctor signed the consent form. At 7 a.m., she was on a continuous pain pump. She was given fentanyl and morphine, and at 7:30, she signed the consent that was witnessed by a nurse. I was notified of what all was going to be done during surgery. I was never notified, I was never notified what was going to be done during surgery, nor was I even called with an update. She never had another chest x-ray until the morning of May 5th, which showed signs of effusion or pneumonia. Every day I had to call and get updates on my daughter. I was never called and told what or how her surgeries went. On Sunday, May 3rd, I had to contact the house supervisor in charge to request a call from a physician. I never got one from the trauma doctor, nor the orthopedic doctor who performed her surgery. When I did talk with someone in the hospital,
She was the one who told me they were moving Emily to a private room because at that time she was not critical. I raised concerns about this due to the fact that she was non-weight bearing on all extremities and needed someone with her to help assist her with eating and drinking, etc. She was moved that Sunday afternoon. On Monday, May 4th, I was allowed in to see her for one short hour. I had to wear a mask. However, when the charge nurse came in to speak to me, she was not wearing a mask. I was told to leave when the hour was up. On May 5th, my daughter called me in tears and in excruciating pain because they had removed her continuous pain pump. I called the charge nurse to speak to her about this and again requested to speak with either the trauma doctor or the ortho doctor. Neither called me. On May 6th, when I woke up, I had a text on my phone from my daughter Emily telling me she needed me up there today. I FaceTimed with her for the last time at 8:30 that morning. She was extremely short of breath and nauseated and vomiting. She had to cut our call short. I again called the house supervisor to request to speak with one of the physicians, particularly the ortho, to learn what surgery was done and get a better idea of recovery time. The charge nurse assured me that the ortho doctor would call me, but the reason that he hadn't was because of HIPAA, even though my daughter had given permission to speak to me. Somewhere between 10 and 11 a.m., I got a call from the trauma doctor telling me that Emily had aspirated and coded for 2 minutes and was back in ICU. At that time, I called my sister to make her aware of the setback. She called me back telling me that Emily was dying and that we needed to get to the hospital. When we arrived at the ICU, none of the doctors or nurses were following CDC guidelines. However, I was denied being able to stay with her following CDC guidelines. I later learned she had coded twice, once for 45 minutes, once for 30 minutes. I had to read this from her medical record after she had died. When we arrived in ICU, there were several nurses and a doctor treating her. Not one of them had proper PPE according to CDC guidelines. The trauma doctor had told me that she did aspirate and was showing signs of pneumonia. After Emily had coded for the 6th or 7th time, we made the decision to stop life-saving measures. I wonder how many times my daughter cried out in pain and no one was there for her. I have a lot of guilt because I feel as though I should have pushed harder, but I did what everyone does. You trust them to take care of her. We are being denied the ability to be an advocate for our families, and we can't even be sure the hospital staff is following guidelines to protect our loved ones. This is not right and has to be changed. Thank you for your time and consideration. Please consider supporting 290. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Guy. Heartbreaking story, like so many. We're going to ask our long-term care ombudsman, Melanie McNeil, to be on deck, and we're going to ask Ms. Mary Lee Boatwright Quinn to come up and speak, representing the Alzheimer's Association.
Thank you, Chairman Petrie, Representative LaHood, and members of the committee. I think Joe Hood took some of my minutes, so I'm not going to share my full testimony, but I do have 2 things that have not been shared. I do want you to know that the Alzheimer's Association is in support of the language concerning the hospital visitation and codifying that caregivers be allowed in a hospital setting with their loved ones. We've heard numerous stories, and people with dementia need their caregiver in order to relay information, much like many of the stories that you have heard here today. And I wanted you to know that the CDC has already put out guidance for hospitals on this. Quote, while limiting visitors is a critical tool in reducing the spread of coronavirus among vulnerable patients and frontline healthcare workers, the CDC recognizes the need for caregivers to be in the hospital with their loved one. Specifically, the CDC recommends policies that limit visitors to the facility to those essential for the patient's physical or emotional well-being and care, i.e. a care partner or a parent. As I said, we've heard numerous stories about family members who've even avoided health care because they were thinking they would be separated from their loved ones, so they haven't gone to the hospital during this time, which is very concerning. Representative Setzler, I'd like to commend you for bringing this bill, because the families who have lived through this have wanted this discussion to happen since March 28th. Since 2 weeks after we were all locked down, that was already too long. And this discussion should have happened much sooner. We have families that now haven't seen their loved ones in a year. And there is a solution, actually, and nobody's talking about it. The study came out just at the end of January from the Rockefeller Institute and Duke Health Policy Center. Testing is the answer. And the reason we're not talking about it is because tests cost money, and who's going to fund it? But with all due respect, members, sorry, it's been really hard to hear all of our constituents who've been dealing with this. If frequent, twice-weekly testing of all staff in this building and all members was what was necessary for this body to be in person and conduct its business, then it's not unreasonable for our citizens to have the testing available that is required to do the important business of loving on, holding hands, and being with their vulnerable loved ones again that have been imprisoned in congregate care facilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gwynn. Is our long-term care ombudsman here? Ms. Melanie McNeil, our state long-term care ombudsman? Or is she online? Okay, we're going to go to someone else first. She's trying to get on virtually. Oh, you got her? Okay. While we're getting our long-term care ombudsman, just to make sure everyone here is aware, the long-term care ombudsmen are responsible for ensuring the resident rights, the rights of all of our people in long-term care facilities of all fashions across the state. Ms. McNeil is our state ombudsman. Ms. McNeil, please tell us your thoughts.
Sorry, I was muted. So thank you, Chairman Petrie and members of the committee. I'll be brief. As the state long-term care ombudsman, our ombudsman representatives are advocates for individuals who live in long-term care facilities. We were kept from visiting for a while by the governor's order and were then allowed to come back and visit with residents. What we're finding is what you've heard in testimony, that residents are missing their family members, really need their family members. In fact, we have letters from some residents about what they need in terms of visits from family members and friends. We've sent those to the governor. We've asked the governor actually to change his executive order to allow essential visitors, and we're hoping that he will take those letters seriously from residents. We know that it's possible to use PPE and take other precautions for people to safely visit. We're asking you as committee members to support this effort. It sounds like there's some wordsmithing that needs to be done, and we'd be willing to participate in that as well. We just know it's so important for residents to have visitors, and we ask your favorable consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McNeil. We're going to ask, we set out on a mission to hear from everybody. We're going to do that. I want to ask that, I think in the interest of making sure we have real clarity here, let's, going forward with the next group, let's maybe have everybody speak up front, okay, at the podium. And unless you're more comfortable in the back, I think, either way it will work. Pick your choice. We have Mr. Tom Bauer. Are you here, Tom? Say again. Oh, he's virtual. Tom Bauer.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'm here remotely. Can you hear me?
Okay, Mr. Bauer, and then Mr. Tim Kibler can be on deck. Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Mr.
Thank you,
Mr.
Mr.
Bauer.
Chairman. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Tom Bauer. I represent Leading Age Georgia, and we represent, our member organization, 65% faith-driven with many long-term care residents and other range of services. I was prepared to say that we supported very much the concept of House Bill 290 because our providers are anxious for all the isolation that you've heard being addressed. It does sound like it needs it. I was prepared to say we'd like to see it fleshed out, and I think Chairman Sessler and members of the committee have been working on it. Sound like they've done that. So we're very anxious to see something move forward and get fleshed out, and would ask, given your earlier comments, if your office could make this substitute available so that we could take a look at it and hopefully make suggestions if we think further ones are needed. Thank
you, Mr. Bauer. And the sponsor is emailing you the substitute as we speak. Mr. Kibler?
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Is it all right to use
Thank
this
you.
mic, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Wherever
May
you're
I-
comfortable,
may
sir.
I demask?
Absolutely. Remove your mask. We'll be just fine. Let me get you, okay, we got you on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am Tim Kibler with the Georgia Alliance of Community Hospitals. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and share some thoughts with the committee. I want to say I appreciate the time that Chairman Sessler took yesterday. We had a very lengthy conversation, very cordial conversation. He understands the concerns that we have and potentially putting patients at risk as a result of adoption of legislation like this. Obviously the tragic stories that have been shared here would wrench anyone's heart, and there absolutely is clarity that there is therapeutic benefit to people being able to be with their loved ones as they attempt to recover. But our concern is that every person who steps on the campus at the hospital heightens the risk of bringing the infection into the hospital and spreading the contagion to people who don't currently have it. And that it is our fear that unless we really thread a needle here, the result will be more families who have suffered more tragedies. And we very much want to avoid that. In the interest of brevity, everybody understands, I think, where the hospitals are coming from. We commit to continue to work with Chairman Sessler as the bill moves through the process. I am concerned we may have a fundamental disagreement about the appropriateness of codifying this proposal, but we are absolutely prepared to try to reach a reasonable middle ground if one is available. I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Any questions from Mr. Kibler? Mr. Kibler, we do have a question. Mr. Kibler, I just want to first say that we understand, to your point, we have one question for you, but we understand well how important our hospitals have been, heroes, as with all long-term care facilities, in protecting our people, especially during these times of this pandemic. So we know well that your comments are all about making sure that we're protective as we can be of our people. All right, let's see here. Representative, it is yours.
Thank you. Appreciate that. You do have some protocol in these hospitals, and you do in these nursing homes, for your workers to come in from out in the communities. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So if we do that with them and we do that with outside folks like myself, I'm in the funeral industry. So I go in nursing homes, I go into hospitals to make removals. We do wear masks, we are checked temperature, we wear gloves, we do everything. So I feel like if we work real hard, we can do the same thing with this, with these folks coming in with their loved ones. But I do appreciate what you're saying, because Lord be, we don't want to spread this. But also, we need the right for these folks to be with their loved ones. So the protocol that you follow with your workers, the protocol that you follow with folks like us that come in and out, maybe that can be done with this. And I hope we can come to a middle ground. And I thank you for your comments.
Thank you, Representative Mathis. I appreciate that. I do, if I have one more moment, Mr. Chairman, I am very concerned. I think
Yes, sir.
Chairman Setzler and Representative McDonald both mentioned that they were hearing from folks that were absolutely willing to undertake the cost of compliance with the PPE issues. I do want to remind the committee that many of our Georgia citizens are not in a position to do that, and that in fact there does need to be a serious discussion about how those family members, et cetera, might be giving access and where the resources are going to come from to provide the safety that Chairman Setzler aspires to in the legislation.
Good,
Thank you very much.
Good point, Mr. Gibler, and thank you for the question, Representative Mathis. Mr. Tony Marshall from the Georgia Healthcare Association is online, and then Mr. Ethan James will be on deck. Okay, Mr. Marshall?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Setzler, for this discussion that is much needed. We represent at the Georgia Healthcare Association about 96% of the nursing centers in the state. And I will tell you that as a body, there is no one that is more committed and desires to have family members to be able to be reunited with their loved ones in our centers. We've seen a significant emotional toll over the last year, and we know the difficulty. We also understand the difficult balance of achieving the prevention of COVID spread in our centers and allowing and preventing social isolation and its detrimental impact. We certainly recognize that and we see that. But as Mr. Hood talked about, most of our limitations in visitation are brought about because of the CMS regulations, the CDC guidelines, and the governor's executive orders. We certainly have a patient's bill of rights that gives our individuals the right to visit their families. Unfortunately, during the public health emergency, that has all been limited because of those regulatory constructs. So we certainly want to work with Chairman Setzler and this committee in helping to reach some language that will allow visitation, that will recognize essential caregivers, and that it do so within the confines and limitations that we have in both the executive order and the federal regulations, as Mr. Hood talked about. But again, thank you for this discussion. It's very valuable and it's very important.
Thank you, Mr. Marshall, and we know well the powerful impact that the nursing home industry has on the most vulnerable of our people in this state. Mr. Ethan James. Okay, all right, okay. Next is Miss Anna Adams, and you're welcome again to choose to speak whatever location you would like, okay? You're on now.
Is that working? Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'd like to first thank Representative Setzler for speaking with us about this bill yesterday and hearing our concerns regarding some of the issues that Mr. Hood and Mr. Marshall both brought up regarding the very strict CMS guidelines that we are all needing to follow right now. I'd just like to start with acknowledging that everyone in this room knows someone who's had COVID. Most of us know someone who's been hospitalized with COVID, and a few of us know people who have died from COVID. And these stories are all incredibly heartbreaking, but I think we can all agree that the reason we are here discussing this issue is because of COVID-19. Hospitals and healthcare providers have had to respond very quickly to the COVID pandemic, and we are certainly living right now in what one could call crisis standards of care. You're seeing parking lot emergency departments. You're seeing the cancellation of non-emergent surgeries. And then with that comes tightened visitation policies. Family-centered care is a #1 priority for hospitals. I want to acknowledge that having family present to help patients heal, help them with hygiene needs, help them just feel comfortable, absolutely accelerates the healing process. And from the hospital standpoint, we would like to get back to that as quickly as possible. But in order to do that, we do have to follow certain guidelines to make sure that everyone is protected. Hospitals are acute care settings, so they are different from long-term care facilities in that this is where the sickest patients are recovering. This is where the most, the communicable diseases are kind of living and being treated. And it is the goal of the hospital through these visitation policies to protect the patient, #1. #2, to protect our staff members who have been on the front lines of COVID for more than a year now. And then also to protect the visitors. So this is not only about the people that are already in our facility, but it's about you who are coming to visit as well. We want to make sure that you don't contract COVID or any other communicable disease. These visitation policies are required by CMS. However, there are some exceptions to those visitation bans, and some of those include end-of-life care, labor and delivery, clergy visitation, inpatient hospice, pediatric care. And I think, on behalf of our membership, more than 160 member hospitals in the state of Georgia, I am hearing from every single one of them that they are making exceptions for these cases. They are willing to have that conversation. They want the family there. And, I think we've come a long way since the beginning of COVID. Back in April, May, early on in the pandemic, when we didn't know about the spread of this disease, we certainly had to restrict as much as possible to protect everyone involved. Now that we are almost a year removed, we have been able to kind of relax those a little bit and allow more people into the facility. And we're happy to do that, and we have seen some improvements in patient outcomes because of that. Some of the concerns that we have with this bill are specific to the position that it puts us between state guidelines, executive order guidelines, and federal guidelines. There's a clear conflict between those 3 guidelines, and we want to make sure that we have, the ability to comply with all 3, but right now that would be impossible. Liability protection that is offered in this bill is a fantastic offer, and we appreciate that. However, it is still the hospital's #1 goal of first do no harm. And so allowing patients into a setting where, or visitors rather, into a setting where they could contract a disease that is incredibly deadly, like COVID-19, we think would be somewhat irresponsible in some cases. So I want to just ask you, first, and as you're thinking about this, please trust your hospitals. They are doing everything in their power to try to make sure that visitors are able to come into the facility. We want you there. We want you to be able to help with your family members and your friends who are in that inpatient setting, but we also have to protect our staff. We also have to protect you, and so that's our goal. We are looking forward to getting out, as I'm sure all of you are as well, to getting out of this pandemic as quickly as possible. That is the #1 goal here. And, I'd just like to point out that when we think about things like requiring PPE, requiring testing, PPE is still not readily available for all of our hospitals. Rapid testing is not readily available for all of our hospitals. And so we're still managing some of those challenges. And while we do require masks and screenings and temperature checks for our visitors, we still don't have full compliance. For example, there is a mask requirement that was put into place by the Speaker of this House, and yet there are attendees and speakers at this meeting who are not masked. And so, the way to end this pandemic, the way to achieve unfettered access to our loved ones, the way to support your healthcare workers, the way to support providers and hospitals and susceptible family members is to wear a mask, is to socially distance, is to wash your hands, is to get a vaccine when it's your turn. And so we will continue to follow the guidance from the CDC, the Department of Public Health, and CMS while doing everything we can in our power to allow for visitors. So I'm happy to answer any questions, but thank you for letting us speak today.
Any questions from our committee members? Any questions from Ms. Adams? Seeing none, thank you, Ms. Adams. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
We appreciate you. We're going to our last presenter now of the evening, Representative Newton. Representative Dr.
That's right.
Mark
Well, I do wear more than one hat, as many of us do, and I appreciate everybody being here. I'll be brief. I am privileged to work with a great team of doctors and nurses at a couple of great hospitals. These are the people who actually, 2 a.m. this past Saturday morning, I was there with them. Those are the people, though, that day in and day out, while I'm over here in Atlanta, they're the ones running toward a room that has someone with breathing problems. Even if it says COVID positive on it, they're still running toward it. We've seen with our staff how much even that can affect our staff. We've had staff out with COVID, a lot of quarantining, but we also see up close and personal with the patients. The patients haven't been able to be here today, but their advocates have been able to be here. And we see how much value that those advocates bring and the comfort and being an essential part of the care team that's there. We've had visitation even in intensive care units where the most high-tech machines, blood transfusions, ventilators, pumps galore are going on. But hospitals have known for years how valuable that was. And I want to take a little different view on this. This is really about the patient's point of view. What is the patient's rights? We've heard a lot from the advocates, once again, because the patients couldn't be here themselves. But if the patients could be here, if they could speak for themselves, I think what they tell us is to look at it from their point of view. I've worked as an ER director over 15 years. We had some of our best improvements in our emergency department care when we looked at it from the patient's point of view. How can we shorten the door-to-doctor time? How can we give them the privacy they need? How can we give them the comfort they need? I think if we look at this as if we were a patient, we'd realize that sometimes what we want great health care, and that's true. But sometimes we need something like a sip of water, a warm blanket, a little help with a meal, maybe some physical therapy, somebody to help walk us around the way Representative Gilligan discussed with her husband earlier. Those kind of things are essential to our care if you put yourself as a patient. I want to be protected from COVID. I want to be protected from tuberculosis and everything else that exists in a hospital care setting. But there's another piece. We can do both. I think we can do better. I think we can recognize the value of physical health and physical care, but it doesn't mean we can't also do something else, which is recognize how much emotional care is. Just finally, just regarding the CMS guidelines, I did think that the DCH made a great point about there is a requirement to follow those. We don't want to put at risk our hospital certification. That wouldn't do any of us any good. But I was just looking at some of the phase 2 visitation guidelines, and it includes, and I'll read a couple of them. It may need some training, but if a caregiver is considered essential, the hospital can work to have a plan so they can be trained, so they can be there every day. That was E. F is reasonable access to support persons for patients with disabilities, including cognitive disabilities. Well, all the dementia that has been discussed in both nursing home care, long-term care facilities, as well as hospital. We've got an exception currently in phase 2 where we are now, if we're willing to use it. And finally, at the discretion and order of the hospital attending physician, where having a family member would be of significant benefit to the patient's clinical care. For example, patients with complex or prolonged hospitalizations. There are some exceptions in the rules now, and I think what we're seeing now is we were in a different situation in April and May, but now we have much of our staff getting vaccinated, including many of us who've had 2 vaccines, which has decreased the risk to the staff. So reasonable things have happened. The second thing is we've got rapid testing available, and I think we've heard from families, they're willing to drive 20, 30, 50 miles to go get a test if that's what it would mean for their patient. But once again, this is the patient's decision. This is not something we're doing for the families, as crucial as that would be, as valuable as it is. This is something that if I'm on the hospital bed, or if my daughter is, it's something she wants. It's something I want. It's something my mother would want. And so I think if we can continue to look at it, let's look carefully. Maybe there's an adjustment to the exact language where we don't put at risk hospital certification, but we maybe take full advantage and recognize that we can take care of physical health and emotional health that's tremendously important, and it's something I want as a patient if I'm ever in the hospital, and I know many of our family members do too. So I hope we can work together, put something together, get something passed, and start to use all the tools that we have to get our patients cared for. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Newton. To all of our members, I hope this has been helpful. That is all of the testimony we have on this bill. Here's what we're going to do. We are going to, I'm sorry? Oh, I'm sorry, I thought someone. Here's what we're going to do. In a bill like this, of this importance, should be thoroughly considered, answer all our questions. That's our intention today. I hope we've made a good effort at that, and we will discover how we proceed going forward. We were to consider also in here testimony on House Bill 261. We will delay that until our next meeting because of the length of this meeting today. And so I hope that everyone has been thoroughly educated on this issue, and we appreciate everybody sticking with us for so long. Thank you, and this meeting is adjourned.